The wolf's teeth closed around empty air, and for one heartbeat, the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Grumble did not run. He did not even flinch. The gray tabby simply sat on the low stone wall with the stolen rabbit clamped between his jaws, staring up at the massive gold-eyed beast, towering over him, as if the wolf were nothing more than an oversized dog begging for scraps. His tail flicked once, slow and unbothered, the way a king might wave off an unwanted guest. The wolf was the size of a young ox, with fur the color of wet slate and shoulders that could have shattered the wall beneath the cat with a single blow. Steam rose from his open mouth in the cold morning air. He had not eaten in 6 days. He had tracked this rabbit for nearly an hour, through bramble and fallen leaves, patient and silent, until the moment he finally closed the distance and sprang. And then, out of nowhere, a house cat half the size of his paw had darted between his legs, snatched the rabbit clean from beneath his nose, and hopped up onto a wall to eat it in peace. The wolf let out a low growl that rattled the frost on the grass. It was the kind of sound that sent deer scattering and grown men reaching for their axes. Grumble blinked at him slowly, unimpressed, and took another bite. This was not supposed to happen. Nothing about the last 6 months was supposed to happen. 6 months earlier, the creature standing in that clearing had been a man. Not just any man. He had been Thalor, ruler of the kingdom of Varen Hollow, a land of green hills and quiet rivers that stretched from the northern mountains to the sea. He had worn fine wool and polished boots. He had sat on a carved oak throne and settled disputes between farmers over property lines. He had eaten 3 warm meals a day, prepared by cooks who competed for his approval. He had never once, in 28 years of life, gone hungry. Now he was a wolf who could not catch a single rabbit without a cat stealing it from him. The curse had come from Voss, a sorcerer who had once served in the royal court as an advisor, back when Thalor's father sat on the throne. Voss had grown resentful over the years, watching younger nobles rise in favor, while his counsel was quietly set aside. When Thalor became king and continued to overlook him, something in the old sorcerer's patience finally snapped. He had waited for the right night, slipped past the palace guards using tricks no one thought an old man capable of, and cornered the young king alone in his study. "You have never once gone without," Voss had said, his voice trembling with old anger. "You have never known what it means to beg for anything. Let us see how a king rules when he must fight for his next meal, like every creature beneath him." The transformation had been sudden and agonizing, bones cracking and reshaping themselves in the space of a few terrible breaths. By the time the pain faded, Thalor was on all fours, and Voss was gone, vanished through some passage only he seemed to know. The curse, Voss had shouted as he fled, would only break through an act of true humility. Not a performance of humility, not a clever trick to fool the magic, but a genuine moment where the proud king set aside his pride for the sake of someone else, expecting nothing in return. Thalor had spent 6 months trying to understand what that meant, and even longer trying to survive long enough to find out. At first, he had assumed his size and strength would make hunting simple. He was wrong. A wolf's body came with a wolf's stomach, one that needed feeding constantly, and the forest around Varen Hollow, while beautiful, was not nearly as generous as it looked from a palace window. Real hunting required patience, timing, and an understanding of the land that no king had ever needed to learn. He had gone hungry more nights than he could count. He had watched smaller, faster foxes steal meals he had spent hours stalking. He had learned, slowly and painfully, what it meant to want something badly and not simply be handed it. But never, in 6 months of failure and near starvation, had he lost a meal to a house cat. Grumble finished the last bite of rabbit, licked one paw with theatrical slowness, and hopped down from the wall. He gave the enormous wolf one final glance, the kind of glance a person might give a puddle blocking their path, mildly inconvenient, but not worth further thought, and trotted off toward the small stone cottage at the edge of the clearing. Thalor stood frozen for a long moment, his stomach aching with hunger, his pride stinging worse than the hunger. He wanted to chase the cat down. Every instinct in his wolf body screamed at him to do exactly that. But something else, some quieter and older part of him that was still Thalor, and not just wolf, held him back. The curse would not let him act from cruelty. He had tested this before, in his darkest and hungriest moments, and each time his body had simply refused to obey. His legs would lock. His jaws would clamp shut against his will. Voss's magic seemed to know the difference between hunting to survive and lashing out from wounded pride, and it punished the second without mercy. So instead, the great wolf simply sat down in the frost-covered grass and watched the cottage door swing shut behind the cat, feeling something he had not expected to feel toward a creature that had just robbed him of his only meal in days. He felt, absurdly, a flicker of respect. Inside the small cottage, Mira was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a stubborn fire back to life, when Grumble sauntered through the cat-sized gap cut into the bottom of the door. She heard him before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of his paws on the wooden floor, followed by the particular silence that meant he had food and intended to enjoy it without an audience. "What did you bring home this time?" she asked, not turning around. The fire finally caught, and she sat back on her heels, brushing ash from her hands onto her worn brown skirt. Grumble did not answer, of course. He never did. He simply carried his prize to the corner behind the woodpile, the same spot he always claimed as his own private dining room, and settled in to eat. Mira was 23 years old, though the deep worry lines that sometimes crossed her forehead in the evenings made her look older when the light was dim. She had inherited the cottage from her grandmother 2 years earlier, along with a small garden, 3 hens, and Grumble, who even then had already been the terror of every mouse and bird for half a mile in any direction. The village nearby, Aldenmere, was a modest cluster of farms and shops that had never seen much excitement, beyond the occasional bad harvest, or a wedding that ran too long into the night. That had changed 6 months ago, when the stories about the wolf began. At first, people dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of tale that grows larger with every retelling at the tavern. A farmer named Edwin swore he had seen a wolf the size of a calf near the eastern fields. A young shepherd claimed something huge and gray had watched her from the tree line for nearly a full minute, before slipping away, without harming a single one of her sheep. Strange, people said, that a wolf so large would leave easy prey untouched. Wolves that big were supposed to be dangerous, ravenous, the kind of creature that emptied a flock in one night. But no flocks had been emptied, no children had gone missing, no one had been hurt at all, and slowly, the fear in the village had curdled into something stranger, curiosity mixed with unease, the sense that something about this wolf did not behave the way wolves were supposed to behave. Mira had never seen the creature herself, not until 3 days ago, when she had spotted a massive shape moving between the trees at the edge of her garden, while she hung laundry to dry. She had gone very still, heart pounding, waiting for it to charge. Instead, the wolf had simply looked at her for a long moment, with eyes the color of autumn sunlight, and then turned and disappeared back into the woods. She had told herself it meant nothing. Wild animals wandered close to homes all the time, especially in a hard winter, searching for anything edible. But she had not been able to shake the feeling that the look it gave her had been almost thoughtful, the way a person looks at someone before deciding whether to speak to them. She pushed the thought aside now, focusing instead on breakfast. She sliced a heel of bread, added a spoonful of honey from the jar on the shelf, and sat down at the small wooden table near the window. Outside, frost still clung to the edges of the garden beds, though spring was supposed to be only a few weeks away. The hens clucked quietly in their coop. Everything looked ordinary, peaceful, unremarkable. She did not know that less than 50 paces from her front door, a king cursed into the body of a wolf was sitting in the frost, hungrier than he had ever been in his life, trying to understand why a small, rude cat had left him feeling more curious than furious. Thalor eventually rose from his spot in the clearing and moved deeper into the trees, partly to search for another meal, and partly because some instinct told him it would be unwise to linger too close to a house with people in it. He had learned that lesson early in his time as a wolf. Humans reacted to his size with fear, and fear led to spears, torches, and traps. He had nearly lost a leg to a hidden snare during his 2nd month cursed, and the memory of that pain had taught him caution above almost everything else. But even as he moved away, some part of his mind stayed fixed on the little cottage and the cat who had stolen his meal, without a shred of concern for the size of the creature he was stealing from. There was something almost admirable about that kind of confidence, he thought, even as his stomach growled painfully in protest. In his old life, as a king, everyone around him had been careful, deferential, always watching for his reaction before speaking or acting. No one had ever simply walked up and taken something from him without permission, certainly not while looking utterly unbothered about the consequences. The cat had not been afraid of him at all. It was a strange thing to find himself thinking about, in the middle of a forest, half-starved and covered in frost. But Thalor found he could not quite let it go. Perhaps it was simply that he had so little else to occupy his mind these days. 6 months of hunting, hiding, and hunger had worn away most of the thoughts that used to fill his days. Taxes, treaties, disputes between lords, the small pleasures of court life. What remained was simpler and rawer, a mind stripped down to want and need and, apparently, room enough to wonder about an unusually bold cat. He spent the rest of the morning searching for food, and finding little beyond a few frozen berries, too bitter to be worth much. By midday, his hunger had become a dull, constant ache, and he found himself circling back, almost against his own will, toward the edge of the clearing near the cottage. He told himself it was simply because the area had proven, however briefly, to have prey worth chasing. He told himself it had nothing to do with curiosity about the woman who lived there, or the strange, defiant cat that had humiliated him that morning. He was not entirely certain he believed himself. From a safe distance among the trees, he watched the cottage for a long while. He saw the woman step outside once, scattering grain for a small group of hens, her dark hair tied back loosely, her movements quick and practical, the movements of someone accustomed to doing every task herself. He saw her pause at one point and glance toward the tree line, as though she sensed she was being watched, though her eyes did not find him in the shadows. He saw the cat too, perched on the low stone wall again, watching the world with the same unbothered confidence he had shown that morning, as though the wolf's presence in the forest was a minor and faintly amusing fact of life, rather than any cause for concern. Thalor lay down in a patch of dry leaves, hidden from view, and allowed himself, for the first time in 6 months, to simply watch rather than hunt. There was something oddly calming about it. The cottage looked warm. The smoke curling from its chimney smelled, even from this distance, of bread and something savory. The woman hummed to herself as she worked, an old tune he half recognized from somewhere in his past life, though he could not place it exactly. He thought of his own palace, empty now of him, likely filled with confused advisors, and a throne no one dared claim while uncertainty over his fate remained. He wondered whether anyone still searched for him, or whether the kingdom had already begun quietly preparing for a new ruler. He wondered whether Voss was watching from somewhere, satisfied with the misery he had caused. Mostly, though, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the rabbit he had lost, and the small, fearless creature who had taken it. By late afternoon, hunger drove him to try again. He caught the scent of something small moving through the undergrowth near a fallen log, and moved into position, with the same careful patience he had spent months learning. This time, he succeeded. The catch was small, barely enough to take the sharp edge off his hunger, but it was something, and he ate it quickly, before anything else could think to challenge him for it. As the sun began to sink behind the western hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and deep purple, Thalor made his way to a hollow beneath an old oak tree that had become something like a den over the past few months. He curled into the space, exhausted, his stomach only partly satisfied, and found his thoughts drifting once more toward the cottage at the edge of the clearing. Somewhere out there, an ordinary woman was likely settling in for the evening, with a strange, arrogant cat curled up beside a warm fire, entirely unaware that the massive wolf haunting the edges of her land had once worn a crown. Thalor closed his eyes, and for the first time since the curse had taken hold, he found himself hoping he would see that cottage again tomorrow. Night fell quickly over Aldenmere, the way it always did in late winter, the last light draining from the sky, almost before anyone noticed it slipping away. Mira lit a single candle on the table and settled into the chair her grandmother used to sit in, a worn but sturdy piece of furniture, with a faded cushion that still smelled faintly of lavender, no matter how many seasons passed. Grumble jumped up onto the table without permission, as he always did, and settled himself directly beside the candle, where the warmth pooled thickest. Mira did not bother scolding him. There was no point. In 2 years of living together, she had learned that Grumble obeyed exactly one rule, and that rule was his own. "You know," she said quietly, more to fill the silence than because she expected an answer, "most cats bring home mice. Small, sensible things, You had to go and steal from something the size of a horse. Grumble flicked an ear in her direction, but did not otherwise acknowledge the comment. One day that wolf is going to remember exactly which cottage you live in, she added, only half joking. And I would rather not be standing here when he comes looking for you. She thought of the golden eyes she had seen watching her from the tree line 3 days earlier, and a small shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air seeping through the shutters. There had been something unsettling about the way the creature had looked at her, not with the wild, empty hunger she expected from a predator, but with something closer to consideration, as though it had been deciding something about her, weighing her the way a merchant weighs a coin to check if it is genuine. She shook the thought away and reached for the small basket of mending beside her chair, determined to finish patching a torn sleeve before the candle burned too low to see by. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old shutters gently, and somewhere far off in the trees, faint and low, she thought she heard something that might have been a howl. She told herself it was only the wind. The following morning arrived cold and clear, with a pale sun climbing slowly over the eastern hills. Mira woke before dawn, as she always did, and spent the first hour of daylight tending to the hens and checking the small garden for any sign that the frost had damaged the young shoots she had planted the week before. Grumble, true to his nature, had already vanished sometime in the night, off on whatever business a cat considered important enough to abandon a warm hearth for. She did not think much of his absence until nearly midday, when she walked to the well at the center of the village to fetch water and found a small crowd gathered near the baker's stall, talking in the hushed, urgent tones people used when something exciting or frightening had happened. "Saw it myself," a heavy-set man named Oswin was saying, gesturing widely with his hands. "Standing right at the edge of my north field, big as anything I've ever laid eyes on. Just standing there. Didn't touch my sheep. Didn't touch anything. Just watched me for a spell, and then walked off into the trees like it had somewhere important to be. That's the third time this week someone's seen it near the fields, and nothing's gone missing," said a woman Mira recognized as Oswin's neighbor, a sharp-eyed grandmother named Edith, who rarely missed an opportunity to share her opinion on any matter, large or small. A wolf that size should be tearing through flocks like they're nothing. "Something's not right about that creature. Maybe it's already fed elsewhere," someone offered. "Maybe," Edith said, clearly unconvinced. "Or maybe it's not truly a wolf at all. My grandmother used to tell stories about cursed men wandering these very woods, back when old Voss still had the king's ear. Strange things happen when a man like that gets angry enough." Several people laughed nervously at this, the way people laugh at old stories they only half believe, uncertain whether to dismiss the idea entirely or feel a small prickle of unease at the thought. Mira found herself listening more closely than she intended to, remembering the golden, thoughtful eyes that had studied her from the tree line, and the odd, almost polite way the massive creature had simply turned and left rather than pursuing her. She said nothing, filled her water jug at the well, and walked home with far more on her mind than she had carried with her that morning. By the time she reached her cottage, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the last of the frost from the grass. She set the water jug down by the door and glanced toward the tree line out of habit, half expecting, and perhaps half hoping, to see the golden eyes watching her again. But the forest stood quiet and still, giving nothing away. Grumble reappeared shortly after she went inside, slipping through his door flap with the casual air of a creature who answered to no one and explained himself to nobody. This time, he carried no prize with him, though Mira noticed a faint limp in his back leg that had not been there the day before. "What happened to you?" she asked, kneeling to examine him despite his obvious annoyance at being handled. The limp seemed minor, more of a soreness than an injury, and he pulled away from her hands after only a moment, clearly unwilling to be fussed over. She let him go, though the worry lingered. Whatever business Grumble had out in those woods, whatever confrontations he might be having with a wolf large enough to swallow him whole, she could not follow him into the trees to protect him. All she could do was hope his evident confidence was matched by enough sense to know when to run. That evening, as she prepared a simple stew of root vegetables and the last of the previous autumn's dried herbs, she found her thoughts circling back, again and again, to the strange rumors from the well. A wolf that spared every flock it encountered. A wolf that watched, rather than attacked. Old stories about cursed men from a village grandmother who claimed to remember Voss and his falling out with the crown. It seemed impossible, the kind of tale meant to frighten children before bed, rather than something a grown woman ought to take seriously. And yet, she could not fully dismiss it either. Not after the way those golden eyes had looked at her. Not after Grumble's mysterious limp. Not after 6 months of a wolf behaving in ways no ordinary wolf should behave. She ate her stew slowly, staring at the small fire crackling in the hearth, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to wonder what kind of creature was truly living in the woods beyond her garden. Outside, unseen in the deepening darkness, golden eyes watched her cottage once more, patient and curious, waiting for a reason to come closer. The second time Grumble stole from him, Thalor was ready. 3 days had passed since the rabbit incident, 3 days of careful hunting and cautious feeding, and Thalor had begun to understand the rhythms of the forest around Aldenmere, far better than he had in the previous 6 months combined. He knew now which trails the deer favored at dawn, which hollows held rabbits at dusk, and which parts of the stream still ran fast enough in the cold to hide fish beneath the surface ice. He had also begun, almost without meaning to, learning the rhythms of the cottage at the edge of the clearing. He knew the woman rose before the sun and fed her hens first, before she ever thought of her own breakfast. He knew she hummed old tunes while she worked, tunes that stirred something faint and half-forgotten in his memory, though he could never place where he had heard them before. He knew the cat left the cottage almost every morning and returned by midday, usually with some small trophy clamped in his jaws, delivered to a private corner behind a stack of firewood, as though it were a great treasure rather than a half-eaten field mouse. This time, when Thalor caught a plump grouse near the edge of the clearing, he did not simply eat where he stood. He carried it deeper into the trees, away from open ground, away from any low walls a cat might use as a perch to watch and wait. He found a fallen log, settled behind it where the brush grew thick, and finally allowed himself to eat in what he believed was perfect privacy. He did not hear the cat approach. He never did. One moment the grouse was nearly finished, and the next, a gray blur darted from beneath the log and vanished into the undergrowth, with the last remaining piece clutched firmly in its teeth. Thalor stood frozen for a long moment, torn between disbelief and something that felt uncomfortably close to admiration. That, he thought, in the part of his mind that still remembered how to form actual words rather than growls and instinct, is either the bravest creature in this entire kingdom, or the most foolish. He gave chase, more out of wounded pride than any real intention of catching the cat, and found himself following the trail of gray fur through brush and bramble until it led, unsurprisingly, straight back toward the cottage. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, well within sight of the low stone wall, and watched as the cat hopped up onto his familiar perch, set down the stolen piece of meat, and began to eat with the same maddening calm as before. This time, Thalor did not simply sit and stare. He let out a low, warning growl, deep enough to rattle the frost on the nearby grass, a sound meant to communicate exactly how unwelcome this repeated theft had become. The cat looked up, chewed once more, swallowed, and then, astonishingly, made a sound of his own. It was not a hiss or a spit or any of the defensive noises a sensible cat might make when confronted by a predator roughly 40 times its size. It was a slow, deliberate meow, almost conversational in tone, followed by an unmistakable air of complete indifference as the cat returned to his meal. Thalor had faced down rival nobles, foreign diplomats, and once, memorably, an entire delegation of merchants, attempting to renegotiate trade terms in his father's favor, rather than his own. He had never, in his life, felt quite so thoroughly dismissed. He remained at the edge of the clearing for a long while after the cat finished eating and disappeared once more into the cottage, his hunger gnawing at him but his curiosity, strangely, gnawing even harder. There was something almost refreshing about an encounter with a creature that showed him no fear, no deference, no careful calculation of his mood, before deciding how to act. Every human he had crossed paths with since the curse began had reacted with pure terror, understandably so, given his size and the danger he represented. But the cat treated him the way one difficult neighbor might treat another, with mild irritation, a complete absence of fear, and an unshakable confidence that he would come out ahead regardless of the size difference between them. It should have infuriated him further. Instead, against every instinct telling him this made no sense, Thalor found himself almost looking forward to their next encounter. The days that followed fell into an unlikely pattern. Thalor would hunt, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and more often than he cared to admit, the cat would appear at some point to claim a portion of whatever he managed to catch. He began, without fully deciding to, adjusting his behavior around these thefts, catching slightly more than he needed, as though some quiet part of him had already accepted that a share would be lost before he finished eating. He told himself this was simple practicality, a way to avoid the frustration of losing an entire meal to a persistent thief. He did not examine too closely why the thought of the cat's arrival, rather than only its theft, had begun to feel less like an insult and more like the closest thing he had to companionship in 6 long, lonely months. Meanwhile, in the village of Aldenmere, the strange rumors about the wolf continued to grow, tangled now with older stories that Edith and a handful of other elders remembered from decades past. Talk of Voss the sorcerer, once a respected advisor before his bitter departure from court, began circulating more openly, spoken over shared meals and market stalls with the particular relish people reserve for a mystery finally starting to take shape. Mira found herself listening to these conversations more carefully than she once had, though she was careful never to contribute much of her own suspicion. She had not told anyone about the golden eyes watching her from the tree line, nor about the odd, almost thoughtful way the wolf behaved whenever it appeared near her land. It felt, somehow, like information that belonged to her alone, a private thread she was not yet ready to hand over to the busy tongues of the village well. On the 4th morning after the grouse incident, she woke to find Grumble already sitting by the door, staring out through the small gap he used to come and go, his tail twitching with obvious impatience. "You're eager this morning," she observed, pulling on her boots. "Off to steal breakfast from your favorite giant again?" Grumble did not dignify this with any response beyond slipping through the gap the moment she opened the door wide enough, vanishing into the pale morning light, with the kind of purpose that suggested he had somewhere important to be. Mira watched him go, then let her gaze drift toward the tree line, half expecting, as she had every morning that week, to catch a glimpse of gold eyes watching from the shadows. This time, she was not disappointed. There, at the very edge of the clearing, mostly hidden behind a thick stand of birch trees, stood the wolf, larger than she remembered, watching the cottage with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood very still, water jug forgotten in her hand, and studied the creature just as carefully as it seemed to be studying her. There was nothing in its posture that suggested an imminent attack. Its ears were relaxed rather than pinned back. Its weight was settled evenly rather than coiled to spring forward. If anything, it looked almost hesitant, as though it wanted to approach but had decided against it at the last possible moment. "I know you're not here for my hens," she said aloud, surprising herself with her own boldness. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "You could have taken 1 week ago if that's what you wanted." The wolf's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the great creature dipped its head, not quite a bow, but something close enough to one that Mira felt an odd chill run through her, that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Before she could decide what to make of this strange gesture, a familiar gray shape darted past her ankles, dashing straight toward the wolf, with what could only be described as a look of triumphant mischief. Grumble stopped just short of the massive creature, sat down calmly in the frost, and began grooming one paw, as though he had every intention of staying exactly where he was. The wolf let out a sound that, had it come from a human throat, might have been mistaken for a long-suffering sigh. Mira, despite the strangeness of the entire scene, despite the fear that still hummed faintly beneath her ribs, found herself pressing a hand over her mouth to stifle an unexpected laugh. "He does that to everyone," she called across the clearing, before she could stop herself. "You get used to it eventually." The wolf's golden eyes shifted from the cat to her, and though it was surely her imagination, she could have sworn there was something almost like amusement flickering behind that ancient, watchful gaze. That single moment of shared, cautious amusement seemed to shift something between them, though neither could have explained exactly what. The wolf did not approach any closer, and Mira did not step toward the tree line either, both of them holding to some unspoken agreement about the careful distance still needed between a lone woman and a creature of that size. But something had changed all the same. The fear that had gripped her chest during their first encounter 3 days earlier had softened into something more like wary curiosity, and the wolf, for its part, lingered at the edge of the clearing far longer than caution should have allowed. Grumble, entirely unconcerned with the delicate balance forming above his head, eventually grew bored of grooming himself and trotted back toward the cottage, brushing briefly against Mira's ankles on his way past, as though reminding her that breakfast was still, in his opinion, overdue. "I should go," Mira said, mostly to herself, though she found her eyes lingering on the wolf a moment longer than necessary. "The hens won't feed themselves." The wolf watched her retreat toward the cottage, its golden eyes tracking her every movement, until the door closed behind her. And then, after a long pause, it turned and disappeared silently back into the trees. For the rest of that day, Mira found it difficult to concentrate on her usual chores. She mended the same torn seam 3 times before noticing she had sewn it crooked. She let a pot of porridge scorch on the fire, while her mind wandered back to golden eyes and a strange, almost respectful dip of a massive head. By the time evening arrived, she had half convinced herself the entire encounter had been some trick of the morning light, some product of too many nights spent listening to Edith's wild theories at the village well. And yet, she found herself setting out a small dish of scraps near the edge of the garden that night, just past the low stone wall, in the exact spot where the wolf had stood watching her that morning. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply being practical, reducing the chances that a hungry predator might decide her hens looked more appealing than whatever she left behind. But some quieter, more honest part of her recognized the gesture for what it truly was, an invitation, however small and however foolish it might prove to be. The following morning, the dish sat exactly where she had left it, completely empty, licked clean. Word of the wolf's strange behavior continued spreading through Aldenmere over the following days, growing stranger and more elaborate with every retelling. Some villagers now claimed the creature had been seen sitting calmly near garden walls rather than prowling the fields for prey. Others insisted it had allowed a group of children to pass within a stone's throw of its resting place without so much as a warning growl. Edith, delighted to have her old family stories about cursed men finally gaining traction, took every opportunity to remind anyone who would listen that strange magic had touched these woods once before, and perhaps it had never fully left. Mira listened to all of it with a carefully neutral expression, offering no confirmation and no denial, though privately, she found herself increasingly certain that whatever walked those woods was no ordinary wolf at all. She began leaving small offerings near the garden wall each evening, telling herself each time that it was merely practical caution, and each morning finding the dish licked clean, the only evidence of a visitor who came and went as silently as smoke. She never saw the wolf again during those first few days, not directly, though she often felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck while working in the garden, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something patient and thoughtful, hidden somewhere among the trees. Grumble, for his part, seemed to have appointed himself as some sort of self-important ambassador between the two worlds, disappearing into the forest each morning and returning each afternoon, with the smug satisfaction of a creature who believed himself solely responsible for whatever fragile peace was forming between his household and the beast in the woods. It was on the 7th day since the grouse incident that Mira finally worked up the courage to walk toward the tree line herself, rather than simply waiting by the garden wall for whatever might approach. She moved slowly, deliberately, making enough noise with her footsteps that nothing hidden among the trees could mistake her presence for a threat or a surprise. "I know you're there," she called out, her voice carrying further than she expected in the still morning air. "You don't have to keep hiding every time I come outside." For a long moment, nothing answered but the soft rustle of wind through bare branches. Then, from the shadows between 2 ancient oaks, the massive shape of the wolf emerged, moving with careful, deliberate steps that seemed designed to appear as unthreatening as a creature of his size possibly could. Mira held her ground, though her heart hammered fiercely against her ribs, and watched as the wolf stopped a respectful distance away, close enough now that she could see the fine details of his gray fur and the unmistakable intelligence flickering behind those golden eyes. "You're not just a wolf," she said quietly, more statement than question. "Are you?" The great creature held her gaze for a long silent moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, shook his massive head from side to side. It was such a small gesture, and yet it confirmed everything the village rumors, the strange behavior, and her own quiet instincts had been suggesting for days. Whatever stood before her in that clearing was no ordinary beast of the forest. It was something far stranger, and far more important than that. The shake of the wolf's head hung in the cold morning air between them like a held breath, and for several long seconds, neither Mira nor the great creature moved. She had expected many possible answers to her question, but a clear, deliberate response had not been among them. Animals did not answer questions. They reacted, they fled, they attacked, but they did not communicate with the careful precision of someone choosing exactly what they wished to say. "If you're not just a wolf," she said slowly, testing each word before she spoke it, "then what are you?" The creature's ears flattened slightly, not in aggression, but in something that looked remarkably like frustration, the particular frustration of someone who understood a question perfectly, but had no way to answer it. He glanced down at the frozen ground, pawed at it once with a massive clawed foot, and then looked back up at her with an expression so plainly apologetic that Mira found herself taking an involuntary step closer before catching herself. "You can't tell me," she guessed. Not with words, anyway. The wolf's head dipped in what was unmistakably a nod. Mira stood very still, turning the strange puzzle over in her mind. A creature large enough to be dangerous, yet gentle enough to leave every flock in the region untouched. A creature intelligent enough to understand human speech and respond with deliberate gestures, yet trapped inside a form that denied him any voice of his own. She thought of Edith's old stories at the village well, tales of cursed men from decades past, and of a bitter sorcerer named Voss, who had once served the crown before some falling out drove him from court entirely. "Voss," she said carefully, watching his reaction closely. "Does that name mean something to you?" The wolf went utterly still, every muscle in his massive body tensing at once, and his golden eyes, which had held only careful patience until that moment, suddenly burned with something far more intense. He let out a low sound from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, but something rawer and more pained, an unmistakable confirmation that struck Mira with far more force than she had expected. "So it's true," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You really are cursed." The wolf took a slow step backward, as though the confirmation had cost him something he had not been prepared to give away so quickly, and Mira understood, with a sudden rush of sympathy that surprised her, that whatever this creature had endured over the past months had clearly worn heavily on him. There was an exhaustion in his posture that had nothing to do with physical hunger, a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was entirely true. "Whatever happened to you, whatever Voss did, I don't think you're dangerous. Not to me, and not to anyone in this village. If you were, you would have proven it 100 times over by now." The wolf watched her for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, lowered himself down onto the frost-covered grass, folding his massive legs beneath him, in a posture that looked almost like surrender, or perhaps trust, offered cautiously, and with visible effort. Mira felt something shift in her chest at the sight of it, a mixture of pity and fascination that she could not fully untangle. She thought of the empty throne that had sat unclaimed in the capital for months, of the whispered rumors that had reached even a small village like Aldenmere about a king who had vanished without explanation, on the very night old Voss disappeared from court in disgrace. She had never connected the stories before, had never imagined the two events might be tied together by anything more than coincidence and timing. But now, looking at the ancient intelligence behind those golden eyes, at the careful, deliberate way this creature communicated despite having no voice to use, the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape she could hardly believe. "You're not just cursed by Voss," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the king, aren't you? King Thalor." The wolf's entire body seemed to sag, whether with relief at finally being understood, or with the sheer weight of the truth being spoken aloud, and he nodded his massive head slowly, deliberately, confirming what Mira had scarcely dared to believe possible. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at the fallen ruler of an entire kingdom, currently resting on the frozen grass of her modest garden, brought low not by any battle or rebellion, but by the bitter grudge of a single sorcerer who had once served him. It was almost too strange to accept, and yet everything about the past week, the strange restraint, the careful communication, The way even Grumble seemed to treat him less like prey or predator, and more like an equal engaged in some ongoing dispute, suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "How long have you been like this?" she asked, settling herself carefully onto the low stone wall, close enough now that she could study him properly, without the distance of fear standing between them. The wolf lifted one paw and drew a rough line in the frost, then added 5 more beside it, a simple counting method that conveyed the answer clearly enough. 6 months. 6 months of hunger, of hiding, of learning to survive as a creature he had never wanted to become, all because a man he had once trusted enough to keep near his throne had decided cruelty was an acceptable answer to being overlooked. "That's horrible," Mira said quietly, and meant it completely. No one should have to live like that, not even a king who might have made mistakes. The wolf's ears twitched at this, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or perhaps agreement, flickered across his expressive features. He had made mistakes, certainly. Looking back now, from within a body that had taught him firsthand what genuine hunger and genuine fear truly felt like, he could recognize 100 small moments where he had overlooked people who deserved his attention, dismissed concerns that should have mattered more, taken for granted comforts that others in his kingdom could only dream of. Perhaps, some quiet part of him thought, this curse was not entirely without purpose. "Is there a way to break it?" Mira asked. "The curse, I mean. There has to be some way to undo whatever Voss did to you." The wolf hesitated before answering this one, uncertain how to convey something as complicated as the terms of his own curse through simple gestures and nods. He scratched at the frost again, this time drawing something closer to a shape than a number, a rough outline that might have been meant to represent a heart, or perhaps something else entirely. Mira studied the crude drawing for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. "Something about feeling," she guessed slowly. "Something about your heart? Your intentions?" The wolf nodded encouragingly, clearly relieved that she was managing to piece together meaning from his limited attempts at communication. "An act of true humility," she said, almost to herself, remembering fragments of old stories where cursed nobles could only be freed through some genuine change in character, rather than any clever trick or convenient loophole. Something real. Something you actually mean, not just something you do to try and break the spell. The wolf's nod this time was firm and immediate, and Mira felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having understood correctly, quickly followed by a heavier realization of just how difficult that requirement might prove to be. Humility was not something easily performed on command, especially not by a man who had spent his entire life being deferred to, obeyed, and admired without needing to ask for any of it. "That won't be easy for you," she said honestly. "Will it?" Being humble. The wolf let out a low sound that might, in another creature, have been mistaken for something close to a rueful laugh, an acknowledgement that she had struck uncomfortably close to the truth. 6 months of hunger and hardship had already taught him more about humility than his entire previous life combined, and yet he suspected the curse demanded something more specific, more deliberate, than simply enduring difficulty out of necessity. They sat together in silence for a while after that, the strange fallen king and the modest village woman, who had somehow become the first person in 6 months to truly understand what he had become, while the pale morning sun continued its slow climb over the eastern hills. Grumble, who had wandered off sometime during their conversation to pursue business of his own, eventually reappeared at the edge of the clearing, watching the unlikely pair with what could only be described as smug satisfaction, as though he had personally arranged the entire meeting and expected proper credit for it. "I suppose I should thank you," Mira said, eventually, glancing toward her cat with fond exasperation, "for whatever role you played in bringing him here." Grumble, predictably, said nothing, though his tail curled with obvious pride as he settled himself onto the low wall to observe the rest of the morning's developments. "I'll help you," Mira said, turning back to face the wolf directly, surprising herself with the sudden certainty in her own voice. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'll help you find a way to break this curse. No one deserves to live like this, trapped and hungry, and unable to even speak for themselves." The wolf's golden eyes held hers for a long, steady moment, and in them, Mira thought she could see something that looked remarkably like gratitude, mixed with a caution born of 6 months spent trusting no one, and expecting danger from every direction. Slowly, carefully, he rose from the frost and took one deliberate step closer, then another, until he stood near enough that Mira could have reached out and touched his massive shoulder if she had dared. He did not close the final distance between them, seeming to understand, even without words, that trust of this magnitude needed to be built slowly, rather than demanded all at once. Instead, he simply lowered his great head one final time, in a gesture that was unmistakably a bow, an acknowledgement of gratitude too large for any simple nod to properly convey. Mira felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved by the strange dignity of the gesture, despite the fear that still lingered somewhere beneath her growing sympathy. Whatever this creature had once been, whatever mistakes he might have made as a king before the curse ever touched him, the wolf standing before her now seemed determined to earn back whatever he had lost, one small act of honest connection at a time. "We'll figure this out together," she said softly, and for the first time since Voss's curse had taken hold 6 months earlier, King Thalor allowed himself to believe, however cautiously, that those words might actually prove true. Word of what happened in Mira's garden that morning did not spread through Aldenmere, not because either of them wished to hide it, but because neither of them could think of a single way to explain it that would not sound like the ramblings of someone who had spent too many cold nights alone, with only a cat for company. A talking wolf who could not talk, a cursed king reduced to scratching pictures in frost. It sounded like exactly the kind of story Edith would invent after too much spiced cider at a winter gathering, and Mira had no wish to become the subject of that particular kind of village gossip. Instead, she kept the secret close, visiting the edge of the clearing each morning, under the pretense of gathering firewood, or checking her modest snares for rabbits, and each morning, more often than not, she found the wolf, waiting for her among the birch trees, patient and watchful. Their communication remained slow and imperfect, built from nods, gestures, and the crude pictures he scratched into dirt or frost. But over the following days, Mira found herself growing steadily more skilled at interpreting his silent language. She learned that a single slow blink meant agreement, while 2 quick ones meant he disagreed but did not wish to argue the point further. She learned that when he lowered his head and looked away entirely, it meant the subject troubled him too much to continue, and she learned, gradually, not to push him further in those moments. "Tell me about him," she said one gray morning, nearly 2 weeks after their first real conversation. "Voss, I mean. What was he like, before all this?" The wolf considered the question for a long moment before scratching a shape into the mud near the base of an old oak tree, a rough outline of what might have been a small, hunched figure leaning on something like a staff. Beneath it, he added several straight lines radiating outward, which Mira eventually understood to represent years, a long span of service. "He served your father," she guessed, "before you became king." A single slow blink confirmed this. "And you kept him on, after you took the throne." Another slow blink, though this one came with a low, uncomfortable sound from deep in his chest, something that suggested regret, layered beneath the simple confirmation. "But something changed," she pressed gently, "between you and him." The wolf's ears flattened, and he scratched at the mud again, this time drawing several smaller figures clustered together, standing where the hunched figure with the staff had been standing alone before. Younger advisors, Mira understood. New voices the young king had preferred over the old counsel of a man who had served his father for decades. "You replaced him," she said quietly, watching the wolf's reaction carefully. "Not all at once, maybe, but slowly. You started listening to newer voices instead of his." The wolf did not confirm this one immediately, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the crude drawing in the mud, as though seeing his own past mistakes laid bare, in a way words alone had never forced him to confront. Then, finally, he nodded, slow and heavy, an admission that seemed to cost him something significant to make. "That doesn't excuse what he did to you," Mira said firmly, sensing the direction of his thoughts. "Cursing a person, trapping them like this, taking away their voice entirely, nothing justifies that. Feeling overlooked is painful. I understand that much myself, but pain doesn't give anyone the right to inflict this kind of suffering on another person." The wolf's golden eyes lifted to meet hers, and something in his expression seemed to relax slightly, as though her words had eased a burden of guilt he had been carrying quietly for months, convinced, perhaps, that his own past carelessness had somehow earned him this punishment. "But," she added, more gently this time, It also sounds like there might be some truth buried in what he did, even if the way he chose to teach you that truth was cruel and wrong. Maybe part of breaking this curse means learning to actually see people the way he felt you stopped seeing him. The wolf held her gaze for a long, thoughtful moment, and then lowered his head in a slow, deliberate nod that felt different from his previous ones, less an admission of guilt and more a genuine acceptance of a lesson finally understood. They continued like this for days, piecing together fragments of his past life through crude drawings and careful questions, while Grumble supervised from whatever perch he had chosen that particular morning, occasionally wandering off to hunt, but always returning before their conversation ended, as though he considered himself an essential witness to the proceedings. Mira learned, slowly, about the kingdom of Varen Hollow, about the green hills and quiet rivers Thalor had once ruled, about the small disputes between farmers and the larger concerns of trade routes and border negotiations that had once filled his days. She learned about a mother who had died when he was young, and a father who had ruled with a firm but distant hand, leaving Thalor to learn kingship more through observation than genuine guidance. She began to understand, piece by careful piece, not a monster or a mindless beast, but a man who had been shaped by circumstances into someone capable of genuine change, if only given the chance to prove it. For his part, Thalor found himself looking forward to these mornings with an eagerness that surprised him. In his old life, surrounded by advisors and courtiers desperate for his favor, he had rarely encountered anyone willing to speak to him with such plain, unguarded honesty. Mira did not flatter him, did not soften her observations to spare his pride, and yet everything she said came wrapped in a genuine warmth that made even her sharpest observations feel less like judgment and more like honest care. He found himself, more than once, wishing desperately for the ability to simply speak with her properly, to explain thoughts and feelings that crude drawings in dirt could never fully capture. The frustration of it gnawed at him almost as fiercely as his hunger once had, though this particular hunger, he suspected, ran far deeper than anything his wolf's body could satisfy. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after their first real conversation, Mira arrived at the clearing carrying a small basket covered with a cloth, and set it down carefully on the low stone wall, before settling beside it. "I know you probably can't eat bread the way I do," she said, pulling back the cloth to reveal a small loaf, still faintly warm from the morning's baking, "but I thought you should have something that didn't require chasing it through the forest for once." The wolf approached slowly, sniffing at the offered bread with obvious curiosity, and after a moment's hesitation, took it gently from where she had set it, careful not to let his large teeth come anywhere near her hand. He ate it slowly, savoring what was, in some strange way, the first meal in 6 months that had been given to him freely, without struggle or theft or desperate hunting. Mira watched him eat with a small, satisfied smile, and Grumble, perched nearby on the wall, watched the entire exchange with an expression that might almost have been approval, as though he had finally decided this particular arrangement between his human and the wolf met his exacting standards. "There," Mira said softly, once he had finished. "Was that so terrible, accepting help from someone else for once?" The wolf's ears flicked, and he let out a low sound that might have been amusement, might have been something closer to gratitude, too large to properly express through sound alone. He understood, even without her saying it directly, that she was testing something important, gently probing at the very quality Voss's curse demanded he learn: the willingness to accept kindness without demanding it, to receive help without feeling diminished by needing it in the first place. It was, he realized with something like surprise, easier than he had expected. Perhaps, he thought, watching Mira gather her empty basket and rise to return to her chores, breaking this curse would not require some single dramatic act of sacrifice after all, but rather this slow, steady accumulation of small, honest moments, each one chipping away at the pride that had built the walls Voss's magic now demanded he tear down. He only hoped, as he watched her walk back toward her cottage with Grumble trotting proudly at her heels, that he would have enough time left to finish tearing them down completely, before whatever danger still lurked beyond the edges of this quiet clearing finally caught up with them both. The stranger arrived in Aldenmere on a gray afternoon, nearly a month after Mira's first real conversation with the wolf, riding a tired horse and asking careful, pointed questions at the tavern that made the local farmers uneasy in ways they could not quite name. His name, he told anyone who asked, was Godwin, and he claimed to be a merchant searching for good grazing land to purchase on behalf of a wealthy client from the capital. But something about his manner did not sit right with the villagers who spoke to him. He asked too many questions about strange sightings in the forest, about wolves and unusual animal behavior, about whether anyone in the area had noticed anything odd happening near the old oak groves to the east. He asked these questions with far more interest than any grazing land merchant should reasonably show, and he asked them, more than once, with a strange gleam in his eye that Edith, watching from her usual spot near the well, described afterward as hungry, but not for food. Mira heard about the stranger from a neighbor who stopped by to trade eggs for a jar of her honey, and something about the description made her stomach tighten with unease, long before she could articulate exactly why. "Ask him what he really wants," the neighbor said, shaking her head. "Watch his face change. Something about that man isn't right. Mark my words." That evening, as the light faded, and Mira made her way toward the clearing to check on Thalor, she found him already waiting among the birch trees, his posture tense and alert, in a way she had not seen since their earliest encounters, when fear and caution had still governed nearly every movement he made. "Something's wrong," she said immediately, reading the tension in his shoulders before she had even fully crossed the clearing. "What is it?" The wolf's ears were pinned back, and his golden eyes kept darting toward the deeper woods, as though he expected something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. He scratched quickly at the dirt, drawing the familiar hunched figure with the staff, and beside it, a second figure that Mira had not seen him draw before, tall and narrow, with what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. "Voss sent someone," she said slowly, understanding dawning with unpleasant clarity. "Someone's looking for you." The wolf's confirming nod was sharp and immediate, and beneath it, Mira could sense a fear that went beyond mere caution, something closer to genuine dread. Whatever this stranger represented, it clearly threatened more than simple discovery. "There's a man in the village," she said. "Calls himself Godwin, says he's a merchant, but he's been asking strange questions about wolves and odd sightings near the eastern groves. Could that be him? Could that be Voss's man?" Thalor's entire body went rigid at the description, and he let out a low, warning growl that seemed to rattle the very air between them. He pawed urgently at the ground, drawing the shape of the sun rising and setting several times in quick succession, a gesture Mira had learned meant urgency, something needing to happen soon rather than gradually. "You think he's dangerous," she said. "Not just curious, actually dangerous." Another sharp nod, followed by a low, anxious whine that sounded almost pleading, an emotion so raw and unguarded that it startled her more than any growl could have. "What does he want? Why would Voss send someone looking for you now, after all this time?" The wolf hesitated, clearly wrestling with how to convey something more complicated than his usual simple gestures could easily capture. He scratched at the dirt again, this time drawing a crude circle, and inside it, a smaller shape that might have been meant to represent a crown. Beside the circle, he drew a jagged line, something that looked almost like a crack running through stone. Mira studied the crude drawing for a long moment, turning the pieces over in her mind. "The throne," she said slowly. "Something's happening with the throne. Is someone trying to claim it, while everyone still thinks you might be dead?" The wolf's nod this time carried a heaviness that told her she had understood correctly, and worse, that the situation was even more urgent than she had first realized. If someone within the kingdom intended to seize power in his prolonged absence, then Voss's continued interest in keeping him hidden, or perhaps even eliminated entirely, suddenly made a great deal more sense. A cursed king wandering the woods as a wolf posed little threat to anyone's ambitions. A cursed king, discovered and somehow restored to his throne, posed a very different kind of problem. "We need to be careful," Mira said, her mind already racing ahead to practical concerns. "If this Godwin really is working for Voss, and he's looking specifically near the eastern groves, that puts him uncomfortably close to here. You can't keep staying in the same den every night, and I should be careful about what I say if he comes asking questions in the village." The wolf's golden eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly, and slowly, deliberately, he moved closer than he had ever allowed himself to before, until his massive head was nearly level with her own. He nudged gently at her hand with his nose, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle from a creature of his size that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. understanding the silent request behind his gesture, the fear that his continued presence might be putting her in danger. Whatever risk comes with helping you, I already accepted it the moment I decided to try. You're not facing this alone anymore, remember? We agreed to figure this out together. The wolf held perfectly still for a long moment, and then, slowly, pressed his massive head against her shoulder, in a gesture of such raw gratitude that Mira found herself wrapping her arms briefly around his thick neck, heedless of the danger such closeness might once have represented. Grumble, who had been watching this entire exchange from atop the low stone wall with his usual air of supervisory importance, chose that precise moment to leap down and wind himself between the wolf's massive front legs, as though determined not to be left out of whatever bond was forming in front of him. Despite the gravity of the situation, Mira found herself laughing softly, a small release of tension that seemed to ease something in all three of them. "We'll figure out what Godwin wants," she said, straightening and wiping quickly at her eyes. "And in the meantime, you should probably move your den somewhere further from the eastern groves. Somewhere he's less likely to think of searching." The wolf nodded firmly, already turning his attention to the practical challenge ahead, and Mira found herself grateful for the shift in focus, grateful for something concrete to plan around, rather than simply sitting with the fear that had settled over their previously peaceful clearing. As the light continued to fade around them, casting long shadows between the birch trees, Mira made her way back toward her cottage, her mind churning with plans and precautions, while behind her, King Thalor watched her retreating figure with an expression that, had anyone human been present to witness it, might have been described as something dangerously close to affection, layered over deep and genuine worry. Whatever Godwin's true purpose in Aldenmere might be, one thing had become abundantly clear to both of them that evening. The quiet, careful peace they had built together over the past month was now under direct threat, and neither of them intended to surrender it without a fight. That night, sleep came slowly and reluctantly to Mira, her mind circling endlessly around golden eyes and crude drawings in dirt, around a stranger's too hungry gaze and a cracked crown scratched hastily into frost. Outside her window, the forest stood dark and silent, giving no hint of the dangers that had begun quietly closing in around the fragile sanctuary she and an unlikely cursed king had built together, one small, honest moment at a time. Godwin lingered in Aldenmere for 3 more days, and with each passing day, his questions grew bolder and more specific. He no longer bothered pretending much interest in grazing land, instead steering nearly every conversation toward wolves, curses, and old stories about the missing king. He offered coins freely to anyone willing to share information, and though most villagers gave only vague, unhelpful answers, Mira knew it was only a matter of time before someone, whether from genuine ignorance or simple greed, said something that pointed him in a dangerous direction. She encountered him herself on the second morning, quite by accident, while purchasing thread at the small shop near the village square. He was tall, with sharp, calculating eyes, and a smile that never quite reached them, and something about the way he studied her when he learned she lived at the edge of the forest near the eastern groves made her skin crawl with unease. "You must see quite a lot of wildlife out that way," he said, his tone carefully casual, in a way that felt anything but. "Any unusual sightings? Large predators, perhaps? Creatures that don't quite behave the way you'd expect?" "Only foxes after my hens," Mira replied, keeping her voice steady and her expression carefully bored. "Nothing worth traveling all this way to hear about, I'm afraid." Godwin's smile widened slightly, though his eyes remained cold and assessing. "A shame," he said. "I've heard such interesting rumors. A wolf larger than any natural creature should be, wandering these woods for months without harming a single flock. You'd think a woman living so close to the forest might have noticed something." "People love a good story," Mira said, forcing a small, dismissive laugh, "especially in a village where nothing exciting happens most seasons. I wouldn't put much stock in tavern tales, if I were you." He studied her for a moment longer, long enough that she felt genuinely uncertain whether her carefully casual performance had convinced him at all, before finally, inclining his head politely, and moving on to question the shopkeeper instead. Mira left the shop with her heart hammering unpleasantly against her ribs, certain that she had just made herself, however subtly, a person of interest to whatever dark purpose had brought this man to Aldenmere. She hurried home immediately, thread purchase forgotten, and did not relax until she reached the safety of the clearing, where Thalor was waiting, having apparently sensed her distress even before she fully explained what had happened. "He asked about me specifically," she said, breathless from her hurried walk. "About living near the forest, about noticing anything unusual. I don't think he believed me when I said it was nothing." The wolf's reaction was immediate and fierce, a low growl building in his chest as he paced the length of the clearing with obvious agitation. He stopped abruptly, scratched a rapid series of lines into the dirt, urgent and jagged, and looked up at her with an expression that needed no further translation to understand. Danger, immediate and pressing. "I know," she said, kneeling to meet his gaze more directly. "I know it's dangerous, but running from this won't help either of us. If Godwin already suspects something, hiding will only make him more curious, not less." The wolf shook his head firmly, clearly disagreeing, and pawed insistently at the ground in the direction of the deeper forest, away from the cottage entirely. "You want me to stay away from here," she guessed, understanding the gesture. "Until he's gone." Another firm nod, though this one carried a weight of reluctance that told her exactly how much this request cost him, how badly he wanted her safety, even at the price of the connection they had so carefully built together. "I won't abandon you," she said quietly, but firmly enough that he could see she meant it. "Not because of one suspicious stranger asking too many questions. We'll simply be more careful. I'll keep my distance from the village until he leaves, and you should move further from the eastern groves like we discussed. We'll manage this together, the same way we've managed everything else." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment, torn visibly between his instinct to protect her by pushing her away, and his genuine reluctance to lose the fragile companionship that had become, in the space of only a month, one of the few things in his cursed existence that still felt worth fighting for. Finally, he lowered his head in acceptance, though the tension in his shoulders remained, a coiled readiness that told Mira he intended to remain alert to any sign of danger, regardless of how their careful plan proceeded. Grumble, sensing perhaps that this was not a moment for his usual mischief, settled quietly at Mira's feet instead, his tail curled protectively around her ankle, in a rare display of something that looked almost like solidarity. As the sun began its slow descent that evening, painting the clearing in soft shades of amber and rose, all three of them understood, without needing words to confirm it, that the quiet peace of the past month had officially ended. Whatever came next would demand more caution, more courage, and more careful cooperation than anything they had faced together so far. Somewhere beyond the eastern groves, Godwin continued his careful questioning, patient and methodical, gathering fragments of information that would soon, whether through cleverness or simple luck, begin pointing him directly toward the truth he had traveled so far to uncover. 5 days passed before Godwin finally left Aldenmere, though he did not leave quietly. On his final morning in the village, he cornered a young farmhand named Oliver near the eastern fields and offered him an alarming sum of coin for any information about strange sightings in the forest, more money than Oliver had likely seen in his entire life spent tending crops and livestock. Oliver, to his credit, initially refused, uncomfortable with the stranger's intensity and the strange, hungry way he spoke about the wolf. But Godwin was patient and persistent, and eventually, worn down by repeated visits and increasingly generous offers, Oliver mentioned, almost in passing, that he had once seen something unusual near a hollow beneath an old oak tree east of the Aldenmere woods, a den of some kind, though he had never gotten close enough to confirm what lived there. It was, unfortunately, precisely the location Thalor had abandoned only days earlier, moved on the advice of caution rather than any specific threat. But Godwin did not know this, and armed with even this small, outdated fragment of information, he departed Aldenmere with renewed purpose, promising Oliver additional payment if the information proved useful. Mira learned of this exchange from Oliver himself, who came to her cottage that same evening, clearly troubled by what he had done and seeking someone to confess to, having heard through village gossip that Mira seemed unusually knowledgeable about the strange happenings in the forest. "I didn't think it would matter," he said, twisting his cap nervously between his hands as he stood at her doorway. "It was just an old den, probably abandoned for weeks already. I didn't think telling him would actually help him find anything real." "It's all right," Mira said, though her heart was pounding with renewed anxiety at the news. "You didn't know what you were dealing with. None of us fully understood how dangerous this could become. Oliver left, looking only slightly reassured, and Mira immediately made her way to the clearing, moving as quickly as the darkening evening light would allow, desperate to warn Thaler of this new development. She found him waiting, as he always seemed to be lately, his golden eyes alert and watchful, even before she finished crossing the clearing. "Godwin knows about the old den," she said without preamble, breathless from her hurried walk. Oliver told him, not realizing how dangerous the information was. "He's already left the village, probably heading toward the eastern groves right now." The wolf's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath and a rapid pacing that spoke clearly of genuine alarm. Though the den itself sat empty now, Godwin's willingness to act on even outdated information suggested a persistence that boded poorly for how quickly he might expand his search once the old den proved fruitless. "We need a real plan," Mira said, watching him pace. "Not just moving from place to place and hoping he loses interest. If Voss sent him specifically to find you, he won't give up easily, and every day he remains in this region increases the chance he stumbles onto something that leads him straight to you." The wolf stopped his pacing and looked at her with an expression that combined frustration and helplessness in equal measure, the particular helplessness of someone accustomed to commanding solutions, rather than searching desperately for them without any voice to organize his own thoughts aloud. "What if," Mira said slowly, an idea beginning to form even as she spoke it, "we gave him false information instead, something that leads him away from here entirely, towards some other part of the forest far from where you actually stay?" The wolf's ears perked with interest at this, and he tilted his head in a manner that clearly invited her to continue. "There's an old ruin north of here," she continued, thinking quickly. "Past the ridge, near the abandoned quarry. Nobody goes there anymore, not since the roof collapsed years ago, but it would look exactly like the sort of hidden place someone might imagine a cursed creature choosing to hide in. If we could plant a rumor that points him there instead of continuing his search closer to Aldenmere, it might buy us enough time to think of something more permanent." The wolf considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. He scratched at the ground, drawing a rough shape that Mira eventually understood represented a question mark of sorts, an inquiry about how exactly she intended to plant such a rumor without drawing suspicion toward herself. "I have an idea about that too," she said, though her confidence wavered slightly as she considered the risk involved. "Edith knows everyone's business in this village, and everyone tells her things eventually, hoping she'll pass along some piece of gossip in return. If I mention, carefully, as though I heard it from someone else entirely, that strange sounds have been reported near the old quarry ruins, it should reach Godwin's ears eventually, assuming he's still lingering anywhere nearby, or has left contacts behind to keep watch." The wolf's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, weighing the plan, and after a moment, he nodded his agreement, though the tension in his posture suggested he remained deeply uneasy about the entire situation, uneasy in a way that went beyond simple strategic concern. "You're worried about something else," Mira observed, reading the deeper unease beneath his agreement. "What is it?" The wolf hesitated, then slowly, deliberately, moved closer, and nudged gently at her hand with his massive nose, a gesture she had come to understand meant genuine concern for her safety specifically, rather than for the plan itself. "You're worried this puts me in more danger," she said quietly, understanding finally. "Because if Godwin realizes the rumor is false and traces it back to me, he'll know I've been protecting you." The wolf's confirming nod carried a weight of genuine anguish, and Mira felt a rush of warmth toward him despite the danger, moved deeply by how much he clearly valued her safety above his own continued freedom. "I'm willing to take that risk," she said firmly. "I decided that a month ago, remember? Nothing about this situation has changed my mind since then. If anything, everything that's happened has only made me more certain that helping you break this curse matters more than staying comfortably safe." The wolf studied her for a long, searching moment, his golden eyes reflecting something that looked, in the fading evening light, remarkably close to profound gratitude, mixed with an aching sort of tenderness that neither of them dared name aloud. Finally, he lowered his head in acceptance, and together, in the gathering darkness of the clearing, they finalized the details of their plan, working through each possible complication with the careful thoroughness of two people who understood exactly how much rested on getting every detail right. The following morning, Mira made her way to the village, well earlier than usual, timing her arrival carefully to coincide with Edith's typical schedule for gathering water and gossip in equal measure. She mentioned, almost as an aside while filling her jug, that her cousin from the northern farms had passed through the previous evening and mentioned hearing strange howling sounds near the old quarry ruins, sounds far too deep and mournful to belong to any ordinary wolf. Edith, predictably, seized upon this fragment of information with obvious delight, already turning it over in her mind for how best to share it with the next person who happened by the well. The quarry, she repeated thoughtfully, eyes gleaming with the particular satisfaction of someone anticipating an excellent piece of news to spread. That would make sense, wouldn't it? All those old collapsed tunnels, plenty of places for something unnatural to hide away from prying eyes. Mira offered only a non-committal shrug, careful not to appear too invested in the direction of the conversation, and left the well with her water jug filled, and her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear over whether their carefully planted seed would grow in the direction they needed it to. Word traveled through Aldenmere with impressive speed over the following 2 days, exactly as Mira had hoped. The story of strange sounds near the quarry ruins, growing more elaborate with each retelling, exactly the way such stories always seem to grow in a village, hungry for excitement, during the quiet, uneventful stretch between winter and spring. Whether the rumor ever reached Godwin directly, or whether some other combination of factors influenced his decisions, Mira could not say for certain. But 3 days after she planted the story at the well, word came back to Aldenmere that a stranger, matching Godwin's description, had been seen traveling north, toward the ridge and the abandoned quarry beyond it, apparently having abandoned his search of the eastern groves entirely. When Mira brought this news to Thalor that evening, relief washed visibly through his entire massive frame, tension draining from his shoulders in a way that made him look, for the first time in weeks, almost like he could finally breathe freely again. "It worked," she said, unable to keep the note of triumph from her voice. "At least for now, we bought ourselves some time." The wolf nodded, then moved closer than he ever had before, pressing his massive head gently against her chest in a gesture of such open gratitude and affection that Mira found herself wrapping both arms around his thick neck, without a moment's hesitation, tears of relief slipping unbidden down her cheeks. They remained like that for a long moment, cursed king and humble village woman, bound together now by far more than the strange circumstances that had first brought them together, while somewhere far to the north, a persistent and dangerous stranger searched fruitlessly among crumbling ruins for a creature who had never actually been there at all. But even as relief settled over the clearing that evening, both of them understood, without needing to speak the thought aloud, that this small victory represented only a temporary reprieve. Voss remained out there somewhere, patient and vengeful, and Godwin, however thoroughly misled for the moment, would not remain fooled forever. The days that followed Godwin's departure brought a fragile sense of normalcy back to the clearing, though neither Mira nor Thalor allowed themselves to grow fully complacent. They understood too well by now how quickly circumstances could shift, how a single overheard conversation, or one unlucky encounter, could unravel weeks of careful caution in a single afternoon. Still, with the immediate threat pushed at least temporarily to the north, they found themselves settling into a routine that felt, for the first time since the curse began, almost peaceful. Mira continued visiting the clearing each morning and evening, bringing small offerings of bread or fruit that Thalor accepted now without hesitation, and their conversations, still limited to gestures and crude drawings, grew steadily richer and more nuanced as their shared vocabulary of understanding expanded. She began teaching him simple signals of her own devising, ways for him to communicate more complex ideas without needing to rely solely on his limited drawings in dirt. A raised paw meant wait, a specific pattern of tail movement, which he practiced with visible effort and no small amount of frustration at his own clumsiness, came to mean danger nearby. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a language between them that belonged to no one else, forged entirely from necessity, and the stubborn determination of two people refusing to let a curse stand permanently between genuine connection. "You're getting better at this," Mira told him one crisp morning, watching as he successfully conveyed an entire question about her garden's progress, using only 3 distinct gestures in careful sequence. "A few more weeks, and you'll have a whole vocabulary, better than some of the merchants who come through the village." The wolf's answering huff carried unmistakable amusement, and Mira laughed, delighted by how far they had come from those first tense, fearful encounters, barely more than a month earlier. Grumble, for his part, had settled into an odd sort of routine of his own, dividing his time between his usual hunting expeditions and an increasing habit of simply lounging near whatever spot Thalor and Mira chose for their morning conversations, as though he considered himself an essential, if largely silent, participant in the proceedings. Occasionally he would deposit some small offering, a mouse or a beetle, directly in front of the wolf with obvious pride, apparently having decided at some point that stealing from Thalor and providing for him were, in his own mind, equally valid forms of the same important relationship. "He likes you," Mira said one afternoon, watching Grumble curl up contentedly against the wolf's massive foreleg, purring loudly enough that the sound carried across the clearing. "In his own strange way. I don't think he's ever warmed up to anyone this quickly before, not even to me, if I'm honest." The wolf glanced down at the small cat pressed against his leg, and something in his golden eyes softened considerably, an expression that, on a human face, might have been described as genuine tenderness. He had spent his entire life as king, surrounded by people who performed loyalty and affection because their positions required it, and yet here was a small, arrogant creature who owed him nothing at all, who had stolen from him without shame, and now curled against him without reservation, offering a kind of unguarded acceptance that felt more valuable than any formal declaration of loyalty he had ever received on his throne. As the days grew slightly longer and the last true bite of winter began, at last, to soften into something resembling early spring, Mira found herself reflecting often on how strange her life had become in the span of just a few short weeks. She had gone from a quiet, solitary existence tending her small garden and her difficult cat to becoming the sole confidant of a cursed king, actively working to outwit sorcerers and scheming strangers on his behalf. It should have felt overwhelming, even frightening, and in quieter moments it certainly did. But more than anything else, she found it felt meaningful in a way her life had not felt in a very long time, since before her grandmother's passing had left her alone in the modest cottage with only chickens and an ill-tempered cat for company. "Do you think about what happens after?" she asked one evening as they sat together in comfortable silence while the sun set behind the western hills. "If we manage to break the curse, I mean, what happens to all of this, to whatever this is between us?" The wolf went very still at the question, and for a long moment he seemed uncertain how to answer, or perhaps uncertain whether he wanted to answer honestly at all. Finally he moved closer, until his great head rested gently against her shoulder, and held the position for several long moments, a wordless answer that conveyed, as clearly as any spoken promise could have, that whatever happened to break his curse, he had no intention of simply walking away from the connection they had built together. Mira felt her throat tighten with emotion she did not fully trust herself to name, and she reached up to rest her hand against the thick fur of his neck, grateful beyond measure for a gesture that required no translation at all. "Good," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "because I don't think I could simply go back to how things were before either, not after everything we've shared these past weeks." They remained like that as full darkness settled over the clearing, two unlikely companions bound together by circumstance and choice in equal measure, while somewhere far to the north, a persistent stranger continued searching fruitlessly among crumbling stone, and somewhere further still, in shadows only he understood, a bitter old sorcerer waited, patient and watchful, for his cursed victim to make the single mistake that would finally reveal his location for good. The peace lasted 3 weeks before it shattered entirely, and when it finally broke, it did so with a suddenness that left no time for careful planning or clever rumors. It began with a sound that no one in Aldenmere had heard in living memory, the low, resonant call of a hunting horn echoing across the hills from the direction of the capital road, followed shortly by the thunder of many horses approaching at speed. Mira was in her garden when she heard it, and something about the rhythm of those hoofbeats, disciplined and coordinated rather than scattered, told her immediately that whatever approached was no ordinary traveling party. She abandoned her half-finished chore and ran toward the clearing, her heart pounding with a fear she could not fully name yet, only sensing with cold certainty that this sudden disruption connected somehow to the fragile secret she had spent weeks protecting. She found Thalor already alert and tense, his ears pricked toward the sound of the approaching horses, his golden eyes sharp with an unmistakable recognition that told her he understood exactly what this meant, even before she could ask.
"What is it?"
she gasped, still catching her breath from the run.
"Who's coming?"
The wolf's gestures came rapid and urgent now, none of the careful deliberation of their usual conversations. He scratched quickly at the ground, drawing a shape that Mira recognized immediately as a crown. Then beside it, several smaller figures arranged in formation, and finally, a jagged line slashing through the crown itself. "Someone's coming to claim the throne," she said, piecing it together as quickly as she could. For real this time, not just Godwin sniffing around asking questions, actual soldiers. The wolf's confirming nod carried a grimness that chilled her more than the cold morning air ever could. He pawed at the ground again, this time drawing a rough map, lines representing roads and hills, with a small mark near what she understood to represent Aldenmere itself. "They know you're here," she whispered, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "Not just somewhere in the region. Here, specifically, near this village." Another nod, and this time, the wolf's entire body seemed to sag with an exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. The weariness of someone who had fought so hard to protect something precious, only to watch it threatened again despite every precaution taken. Mira's mind raced through possibilities. If soldiers were coming specifically toward Aldenmere, then somewhere along the way, someone had connected enough pieces of the puzzle to point directly here. Whether through Godwin's earlier investigations feeding back to whoever now sought the throne, or through some other channel of information she and Thalor had failed to anticipate entirely. "We need to move you," she said urgently. "Now, before they arrive, somewhere they won't think to search immediately." But even as she spoke the words, the sound of the approaching horses grew louder, closer, unmistakably nearer than any reasonable escape route could now account for. Whoever led this party had moved with speed and precision that suggested careful planning rather than a simple scouting mission, and within moments, the first riders crested the ridge overlooking the clearing itself. Mira's breath caught in her throat as she counted at least a dozen mounted figures, dressed not in the simple traveling clothes of merchants or scouts, but in the polished, deliberate armor of trained soldiers, their formation tight and disciplined even as they navigated the uneven forest terrain. At the head of the formation rode a figure Mira did not recognize, a broad-shouldered man with a hard, calculating face and eyes that swept across the clearing, with the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to hunting far more dangerous prey than ordinary wolves. Beside him, unmistakably, rode Godwin, no longer pretending at any merchant's disguise, his expression carrying the satisfied gleam of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. "There," Godwin called out, pointing directly toward where Thalor stood frozen at the edge of the tree line. "Exactly where I suspected all along, once I realized the quarry rumor had been planted deliberately to mislead me." Mira's stomach dropped with cold dread as she understood, in that terrible instant, that their careful deception had not fooled him nearly as thoroughly as they had believed. He had simply allowed them to think it had, buying himself time to gather the resources needed for a far more overwhelming approach. "Stand aside," the broad-shouldered leader commanded, his voice carrying easily across the clearing with the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "This creature belongs to Lord Ashvale now, by right of discovery and by order of the Emergency Council, governing in the absence of a confirmed king." "Lord Ashvale," Mira repeated, the name meaning nothing to her directly, though the implication behind it chilled her thoroughly. Someone had already positioned themselves to claim power, and finding Thalor, whether to eliminate him permanently or to control him as leverage, clearly served that ambition perfectly. Thalor let out a warning growl, low and dangerous, positioning himself protectively between Mira and the approaching riders despite being hopelessly outnumbered by trained soldiers who carried spears, nets, and heavy chains clearly designed for exactly this purpose. "Don't," Mira said quickly, placing a steadying hand against his flank, even as her heart hammered with terror for both of them. "Fighting them directly will only get you hurt, or worse, there are too many." But the wolf's protective instincts overrode any careful strategic thinking in that moment, and as the first riders urged their horses forward, weapons raised and nets unfurling, Thalor let out a fierce, defiant roar that echoed through the clearing and sent birds scattering from every nearby tree, a sound that carried within it every ounce of a king's fury, finally unleashed against those who dared to threaten what little he had left to protect. The nets came first, heavy-weighted things designed to entangle a creature far smaller than the massive wolf they were meant to capture. Thalor dodged the initial throw with a speed that surprised even the soldiers who had clearly trained for this exact confrontation, twisting away with an agility his months of hard survival in the forest had taught him that his old, comfortable palace life never could have. "Careful," the broad-shouldered leader shouted to his men, his voice sharp with warning. "Lord Ashvale wants him alive and unharmed. Dead, he's worthless to our claim." This information, shouted carelessly across the chaos of the clearing, told Mira something crucial. Whatever Lord Ashvale intended, he needed Thalor alive, likely to use him as proof of some claim to legitimacy, or perhaps to hold him as a bargaining tool against whatever remained of the loyal court back in the capital. It was, at least, a small mercy amid the terror of the moment, though it did nothing to lessen the danger of capture itself. "Run!" Mira shouted at Thalor, backing toward the tree line herself even as two soldiers moved to encircle her, clearly recognizing that she represented a valuable piece of leverage in her own right, given her obvious connection to the creature they sought. "Don't worry about me. Just run." But the wolf would not abandon her, not even in the face of overwhelming odds, and instead of fleeing toward the deeper forest, as she desperately wanted him to, he pivoted and charged directly at the soldiers closing in around her, his massive frame crashing through their formation, with enough force to send two men sprawling into the frost-covered undergrowth. Grumble, who had been watching the chaos unfold from his perch atop the low stone wall, chose that precise moment to add his own small contribution to the confusion, launching himself directly at the face of a soldier attempting to grab Mira's arm, claws extended and teeth bared with a ferocity entirely disproportionate to his modest size. The startled soldier stumbled backward with a cry of pain, momentarily releasing his grip, and Mira used the split second of freedom to dart away, ducking beneath a swinging net and scrambling toward the relative safety of a cluster of dense underbrush. The clearing had descended into complete chaos now, soldiers shouting commands that competed and contradicted each other, horses whinnying in alarm at the sudden violence, and through it all, Thalor fought with a desperate, protective fury that seemed to draw on reserves of strength Mira had never seen him display before, even in his most successful hunts. "Take the woman," Godwin's voice cut through the noise, cold and calculating, even amid the confusion. "If we have her, the beast will do exactly as we say." This threat seemed to reach Thalor even through the chaos of battle, and his golden eyes found Mira's for one desperate, searching moment across the clearing, communicating an anguish that needed no translation at all. He understood, with terrible clarity, that Godwin's plan represented a far more effective strategy than any net or chain, using her safety as leverage against his own freedom and defiance. "Don't you dare," Mira shouted, scrambling back toward more open ground rather than deeper into the underbrush, refusing to let herself become the very weapon Godwin intended to use against Thalor. "I won't be the reason you surrender to them." But her defiant declaration came a moment too late. A soldier who had circled wide through the trees emerged suddenly behind her, grabbing her firmly by the arm before she could react, his grip painful and unyielding despite her immediate struggle against it. Thalor's response to seeing her captured was instantaneous and devastating. Whatever careful restraint the curse had imposed on him regarding acts of petty violence seemed to evaporate entirely in the face of this direct threat to someone he had grown to care for so deeply, and he tore through the remaining soldiers between himself and Mira, with a ferocity that scattered the disciplined formation entirely, sending men diving for cover, as his massive jaws and powerful frame turned the tide of the confrontation with terrifying speed. Within moments, he had reached the soldier holding Mira captive, and a single warning snarl, teeth bared mere inches from the man's face, was enough to convince him to release his grip entirely and stumble backward in retreat. "Fall back," the broad-shouldered leader finally called out, recognizing that the confrontation had turned decisively against his forces. "Regroup at the ridge. We'll return with proper reinforcements." The remaining soldiers, bruised and thoroughly demoralized, retreated hastily toward their waiting horses, Godwin among them, though his parting glance toward Mira and Thalor carried a promise of future return that chilled her far more than the departing hoofbeats echoing away into the distance. As silence finally settled back over the battered clearing, Mira sank to her knees, adrenaline draining away, and leaving her trembling with the full weight of what had just occurred. Thalor moved immediately to her side, nudging gently at her with obvious concern, checking for any injury with an urgency that spoke volumes about how close they had both come to catastrophe. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook considerably. "Just frightened. That was too close, Thalor. Far too close." Grumble, who had emerged from wherever he had retreated during the worst of the fighting, padded over and pressed himself against her leg, his usual arrogant confidence replaced, just this once, by something that looked remarkably like genuine concern for her well-being. "They'll come back," Mira said, looking up at Thalor with growing dread. "With more soldiers. We can't stay here anymore. Not you, and maybe not me either, now that they know I've been helping you." The wolf's expression, as he met her gaze in the fading afternoon light, carried a resolve that told her he had already reached the same painful conclusion. Whatever peace they had built together in this quiet clearing over the past weeks had officially come to an end. And now, with Lord Ashvale's forces aware of both their locations and their connection to each other, they would need to find somewhere new, somewhere safer, if they hoped to survive long enough to finally break the curse that had brought them together in the first place. They left the clearing before nightfall, moving quickly and quietly through the forest, in a direction Thalor seemed to choose with deliberate purpose, away from both the eastern groves Godwin had already searched, and the northern ridge where the soldiers had retreated to regroup. Mira carried only what she could gather in a few frantic minutes: a small bag of food, a warm cloak, and a knife her grandmother had once used for skinning rabbits, tucked securely at her belt for whatever protection it might offer. Grumble trotted alongside them with unusual seriousness, none of his typical arrogant swagger, evident as he seemed to understand, in whatever way cats understand such things, that the situation demanded genuine caution rather than casual mischief. "Where are we going?" Mira asked quietly, as the last light faded from the sky, and the forest around them grew increasingly dark and unfamiliar. The wolf could not answer directly, of course, but he continued moving with clear purpose, occasionally pausing to let her catch her breath, or navigate a particularly difficult stretch of terrain, always glancing back to ensure she remained close behind him. They traveled for nearly 3 hours before Thalor finally led them to a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of thick ivy, tucked into the base of a rocky hillside that Mira had never known existed, despite having lived her entire life within a day's walk of this forest. The cave was small but dry, sheltered from the wind, and defensible in a way the open clearing near her cottage had never been. "This will do," she said, sinking gratefully onto the cave's stone floor, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the harrowing events of the day. "At least for tonight." The wolf settled beside her, close enough that his warmth helped ward off the worst of the evening chill, and for a long while, neither of them moved or attempted any conversation, simply grateful for the temporary safety this hidden refuge provided. "I keep thinking about what that leader said," Mira finally ventured, breaking the silence as her mind returned, inevitably, to the terrifying confrontation. "About Lord Ashvale wanting you alive. What do you think he actually intends to do with you, if they manage to capture you?" Thalor's expression grew troubled, and he scratched slowly at the cave's dusty floor, drawing a shape Mira eventually recognized as a throne, and beside it, a figure standing not upon it, but beside it, as though controlling from a position of influence rather than direct occupation. "He wants to use you," she said slowly, working through the implication. "Not replace you outright, but control you somehow. Force you to rule while he actually holds the real power." The wolf's nod confirmed this grim assessment, and Mira felt a fresh wave of anger at the sheer cruelty of such a plan, using a cursed king as a puppet, while ambitious men pulled the strings from behind a false appearance of legitimate succession. "We won't let that happen," she said firmly, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how difficult keeping such a promise might prove against the resources of a wealthy, ambitious lord, commanding trained soldiers, and apparently unlimited patience for pursuit. They spent the following days moving carefully between hidden shelters, never remaining in one location for more than 2 nights, always alert for any sign of pursuit. Mira found herself growing steadily more capable in ways she never would have imagined possible only weeks earlier, learning to move silently through unfamiliar terrain, to identify edible plants and safe water sources, to read the subtle signs of danger that Thalor's more experienced instincts picked up on almost instantly. Their improvised language of gestures and drawings continued expanding during this difficult period, born now from necessity, rather than the leisurely curiosity of their earlier weeks together. Thalor developed increasingly sophisticated ways to communicate tactical information, warning of nearby dangers, suggesting directions to travel, indicating when it seemed safe to rest, and when continued movement remained essential. On the 5th night of their flight, huddled together in another small, hastily discovered shelter, Mira found herself reflecting on how strange, and yet how right, this new existence felt, despite the constant danger and exhaustion. "I never imagined my life taking this direction," she admitted quietly, watching the small fire she had carefully built cast flickering shadows against the walls of their temporary refuge. "A month ago, the most exciting thing that happened to me was Grumble, stealing food from the neighbor's kitchen. Now I'm fleeing through the forest with a cursed king, being hunted by soldiers loyal to some ambitious lord I've never even met." The wolf's answering huff carried a wry, tired humor that made her smile despite the exhaustion weighing on both of them. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked, more seriously now. "If you could go back to that morning when Grumble first stole your rabbit, and somehow avoid all of this danger and difficulty that followed, would you choose differently?" Thalor considered the question for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight, as he seemed to genuinely weigh the honest answer, rather than offering some easy, comfortable response. Finally, he shook his head slowly, deliberately, and moved closer to press his massive head gently against her shoulder, in a gesture that had become, over these past difficult days, their most reliable way of communicating feelings too large for simple gestures alone to properly capture. "Good," Mira whispered, leaning into the comforting warmth of his presence. "Because I don't regret it either, despite everything. Whatever happens next, I'm glad Grumble decided to steal that rabbit." As if summoned by this acknowledgement of his role in bringing them together, Grumble, who had been curled near the small fire pretending disinterest in the entire conversation, opened one eye and let out a soft, satisfied sound before returning to his nap, apparently content with the credit finally given, where it was clearly due. The following morning brought fresh challenges, as Thalor's keen senses detected the unmistakable scent of unfamiliar horses somewhere in the distance, carried on the shifting morning wind. They broke camp immediately, moving with urgent haste deeper into unfamiliar territory, aware that Lord Ashvale's forces had clearly expanded their search pattern significantly since the confrontation at Mira's clearing. "We need somewhere they won't think to look," Mira said, as they paused briefly to catch their breath after a particularly difficult stretch of rough terrain. "Somewhere further from Aldenmere entirely, perhaps. Do you know this part of the forest well enough to find something like that?" The wolf hesitated, then scratched a new shape into the soft earth beneath a fallen log, one Mira had not seen before. A series of jagged peaks that clearly represented mountains, with a small circle nestled among them. "Mountains," she said slowly. "There's somewhere in the mountains you think we could hide?" His confirming nod carried a complicated mixture of hope and hesitation, and he added several more marks to his rough drawing, symbols that gradually resolved, through patient interpretation, into what Mira eventually understood represented an old hermit's dwelling, someone who lived in deliberate isolation from the rest of the kingdom, far from any road or settlement that soldiers might think to search. "Do you trust this person?" she asked, recognizing the significance of revealing such a hidden refuge to her, even indirectly through his drawings. The wolf's answer came slowly, thoughtfully, a single measured nod that carried more weight than his usual quicker confirmations, suggesting a history or connection to this hermit that ran deeper than simple convenient shelter. "Then let's go there," Mira decided, gathering her small pack of supplies with renewed determination despite the exhaustion still weighing heavily on her limbs. "If it's far enough from everything Lord Ashvale's men know to search, it might give us the time we desperately need to find some way to finally break this curse for good." They set off toward the distant mountains as the sun climbed higher overhead, three unlikely companions bound together now by danger and determination in equal measure, moving steadily away from everything familiar, toward whatever uncertain refuge and possibility awaited them among the ancient, silent peaks rising against the pale morning sky. The journey toward the mountains took the better part of 4 days, each one harder than the last as the terrain grew steeper and the nights grew colder despite the slowly advancing season. Mira's boots wore thin against sharp stone, and her supplies dwindled faster than she had anticipated, but Thalor proved a resourceful guide, leading them along hidden paths and sheltered valleys that kept them well clear of any main roads where Lord Ashvale's soldiers might patrol. On the second night of their mountain journey, disaster nearly struck when a sudden rockslide, triggered by nothing more than an unlucky gust of wind, loosening already unstable stone, sent debris tumbling down the slope directly toward where they had made camp for the evening. Thalor's quick reaction, shoving Mira bodily out of the path of the largest falling rocks, likely saved her from serious injury, though he took a glancing blow to his shoulder that left him limping noticeably for the following day's travel. "You should have let me move myself," Mira scolded gently that evening, examining the bruised, swollen area along his shoulder with careful hands, grateful it appeared to be nothing worse than a deep bruise rather than any broken bone. "You didn't need to throw yourself in front of falling rocks for me." The wolf's expression, as he watched her tend to his injury, carried an unmistakable message that needed no elaborate gesture to convey. He would make exactly the same choice again, without hesitation, regardless of the cost to himself. Grumble, who had scrambled to safety atop a nearby boulder during the rock slide with considerably more grace than either of his companions, watched this tender exchange with what might almost have been approval, before returning to his self-appointed task of watching for any sign of pursuit from his elevated vantage point. By the fourth day, exhausted and increasingly worried about their dwindling supplies, they finally crested a final ridge to find a small, weathered cottage nestled into a sheltered hollow among the peaks, smoke curling gently from its chimney, in a way that suggested someone still called this remote place home, despite its considerable distance from any other sign of civilization. Thalor approached cautiously, and Mira followed close behind, uncertain what kind of reception awaited them from whoever lived in such deliberate isolation. Before they had covered half the remaining distance, the cottage door swung open, revealing an elderly woman with sharp, knowing eyes and hair the color of fresh snow, who studied the approaching wolf with an expression that held no fear at all, only a weary sort of recognition. "So," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the mountain air, "the curse finally drove you all the way up here, did it? I wondered how long it might take." Mira stared in surprise, realizing this woman clearly knew far more about their situation than any stranger reasonably should. "You know him," she said. "You know what he is." "I know what Voss did to him, yes," the old woman replied, gesturing them both toward the warmth of her small home. "I knew Voss myself, once, many years ago, before bitterness consumed whatever good remained in him. Come inside, both of you, and the cat as well, I suppose, since he seems determined to accompany you regardless of anyone's invitation." Grumble, apparently taking this as sufficient welcome, trotted past them all, directly into the cottage, as though he owned the place, settling himself immediately beside the warm hearth with the confident air of a creature entirely accustomed to claiming the best available spot for himself. The old woman, who introduced herself simply as Wren, provided them with warm food and a safe place to rest for the first time in nearly a week, and as evening settled over the mountain hollow, she listened carefully, while Mira explained everything that had happened since that first morning Grumble stole a rabbit from an enormous, mysterious wolf. "An act of true humility," Wren repeated thoughtfully, once Mira finished recounting everything they had pieced together about the curse's requirements. "Yes, that sounds exactly like something Voss would demand, given his particular grievance against pride and privilege. But I suspect there's more to it than simple gestures of kindness, however genuine they might be." "What do you mean?" Mira asked, leaning forward with sudden, urgent interest. "Voss's curses were never simple," Wren explained, settling into a worn chair beside the fire, with the ease of long familiarity. He believed deeply in symmetry, in lessons that mirrored the exact wound that inspired them. If he cursed a proud king to learn humility, the breaking of that curse likely requires not just any act of kindness, but something specific, something that directly addresses the very failure that drove him to cast the curse in the first place. Thalor's ears perked with intense interest at this, and he scratched quickly at the dirt floor near the hearth, drawing once again the shape of the hunched figure with the staff that Mira had come to recognize as his representation of Voss himself. "You think," Mira said slowly, working through the implication, that breaking the curse might require something involving Voss directly, not just general kindness toward anyone, but something specific between the two of them. Ren nodded gravely. In my experience with such magic, yes, that would be my guess. A curse born from a broken relationship often requires healing, or at least resolution, within that same relationship to be truly undone. Simple acts of goodness toward others may soften a curse, may even weaken it gradually. But the final breaking often demands confronting the very source of the original wound directly. This revelation settled heavily over the small cottage, and Mira watched Thalor's expression shift from hopeful interest to something more troubled and complicated. Confronting Voss directly meant facing the very sorcerer whose forces, or at least whose grievance, had already nearly cost them everything through Godwin's relentless pursuit and Lord Ashvale's armed soldiers. "Do you know where Voss might be found?" Mira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from Ren's grave expression. "I have my suspicions," the old woman admitted. "There's an old tower, abandoned by the crown, generations ago, tucked into a valley, 3 days' journey from here. Voss always had a fondness for isolated, forgotten places, much like this cottage itself, if I'm honest about my own preferences. If he's hiding anywhere while orchestrating events from the shadows, I would wager considerable coin that it's there." Thalor's expression grew resolute despite the evident fear still flickering behind his golden eyes, and he rose from his spot near the fire, moving toward the small window that overlooked the darkening valley beyond, as though already contemplating the difficult journey that clearly awaited them. "We'll need to be very careful," Mira said, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. "If Voss really is there, and if confronting him is truly the key to breaking this curse, we can't simply walk in unprepared. We need a plan, and we need to consider that Lord Ashvale's soldiers might still be searching this region as well." Ren rose slowly from her chair, moving toward a worn wooden chest tucked into the corner of her small cottage, and began sorting through its contents with the careful deliberation of someone who had kept these particular items stored away for exactly this kind of eventuality. "I may have a few things that could prove useful," she said, glancing back at them with an expression that suggested decades of careful preparation for a moment she had perhaps always suspected might eventually arrive. "Rest tonight, both of you. Tomorrow, we'll begin preparing properly for whatever awaits at that tower." As the fire crackled softly and the mountain wind howled gently against the cottage's sturdy walls, Mira found herself watching Thalor's silhouette against the window, understanding that whatever came next would likely prove to be the most dangerous and decisive chapter of their journey together so far. The tower rose from the valley floor like a broken tooth, its upper levels crumbled away by decades of neglect, but its lower chambers, Ren had assured them, remained sturdy enough to shelter someone determined to hide from the world. They approached it on the morning of the 3rd day since leaving her mountain cottage, having traveled cautiously through terrain, deliberately chosen to avoid any roads or paths that Lord Ashvale's soldiers might still be patrolling. Ren had insisted on accompanying them partway, providing Mira with a small pouch of herbs she claimed could counter certain minor enchantments, along with careful instructions about the particular vulnerabilities of Voss's specific brand of magic, gathered from decades of half-remembered conversations before their old acquaintance had curdled into bitter estrangement. He was never a fighter, Ren had told them before finally turning back toward her mountain home. His strength lies entirely in patience and cleverness, not raw power. If you can catch him off guard, before he has time to prepare some clever trap, you stand a real chance. Now, standing at the edge of the valley with the broken tower looming ahead, Mira felt her nerves fraying despite Ren's reassurances. Thalor moved beside her with the careful, deliberate steps of a predator approaching dangerous, unfamiliar territory, every sense alert for any sign of a trap or ambush. Grumble, surprisingly, had insisted on accompanying them the entire journey from Ren's cottage, refusing every attempt Mira made to leave him behind in the relative safety of the mountains. Something in his manner suggested he considered this confrontation his business as much as anyone else's, a strange loyalty that Mira had come to expect from him, despite his usual arrogant independence. They approached the tower's entrance cautiously, finding the heavy wooden door slightly ajar, as though someone expected visitors, or perhaps simply no longer bothered with such precautions, in a location so thoroughly abandoned by the rest of the kingdom. "Stay alert," Mira whispered, more to herself than to her companions, her hand resting on the hilt of her grandmother's old knife, though she harbored few illusions about how much protection it might actually provide against genuine sorcery. Inside, the tower's lower chamber proved dimly lit by scattered candles, their flickering light casting long shadows across shelves crowded with old books, strange bottled ingredients, and scattered notes covered in cramped, urgent handwriting. And there, seated at a worn wooden desk near the chamber's center, sat an old man, whose hunched posture and weathered staff matched exactly the crude drawings Thaler had scratched into dirt so many times over the past weeks. Voss looked up slowly as they entered, his expression carrying none of the surprise Mira had expected, only a weary, resigned acknowledgement that suggested he had anticipated this confrontation for some time. "I wondered how long it would take you to find your way here," he said, his voice thin and dry with age, though something sharp and calculating still glinted behind his tired eyes. "And I see you've brought company this time, rather than simply skulking through the forest alone." Thaler let out a low growl, every muscle tensed with barely restrained fury at finally facing the man responsible for 6 months of suffering and hardship. But he did not immediately attack, some deeper instinct, or perhaps simple caution, holding him carefully in check. "We know about Lord Ashvale," Mira said, stepping forward despite her racing heart, determined not to let fear silence her, now that they had finally come this far. "We know he's trying to use Thalor as a puppet, to seize real power for himself. Is that truly what you wanted, when you cursed him? To hand the kingdom over to someone even worse?" Something flickered across Voss's weathered features at this question, a complicated mixture of emotions that suggested her words had struck closer to an uncomfortable truth than he wished to admit. "I never intended for Ashvale to become involved," he admitted slowly, setting down the quill he had been holding when they entered. "My curse was meant to teach a lesson, nothing more. What that ambitious lord has done with the resulting chaos is entirely his own doing, not mine." "But you could stop it," Mira pressed. "You could end this right now, simply by releasing Thalor from whatever binds him. Whatever grievance you carried against him, surely it's been answered by now. Look at him. Look at what 6 months of genuine suffering has taught him that no amount of comfortable ruling ever could." Voss's gaze shifted to Thalor, studying him with an intensity that seemed to search for something specific, some proof or confirmation that might satisfy whatever standard his curse demanded, before releasing its grip. "The curse isn't mine to simply release," Voss said finally, and something in his tired voice suggested genuine regret rather than mere excuse-making. "I told you when I cast it, and I meant it truthfully. Only a genuine act of humility, freely chosen rather than performed for my benefit, can break what I set in motion. I have no power to undo it myself, even if I wish to." "Then help us understand exactly what that means," Mira said, frustration creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm and measured. "We've spent weeks trying to interpret vague clues and half-understood requirements. If you know something more specific about what's needed, tell us now, while there's still time before Ashvale's forces catch up with us entirely." Voss studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward Thalor, who had remained tensely silent throughout this entire exchange, his golden eyes fixed intently on the sorcerer who had upended his entire existence. "The curse requires him to demonstrate, through genuine action rather than mere words, that he has learned to value someone else's well-being above his own pride or comfort," Voss said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "Not performed for an audience, not calculated to satisfy magical requirements, but chosen freely, because it is simply the right thing to do, regardless of personal cost." Thalor's ears flattened at this explanation, and he glanced toward Mira with an expression that suggested he already understood, with sudden and painful clarity, exactly what such a moment might require of him when it finally arrived. "And if that moment already happened," Mira said carefully, thinking of the confrontation in the clearing, of Thalor's fierce defense of her against Godwin's soldiers despite the danger to himself, "why hasn't the curse already broken?" Voss's expression grew thoughtful, almost curious, as though this question genuinely puzzled him as much as it did them. "Perhaps it was not yet the right moment," he said finally. "Or perhaps circumstances have not yet demanded the full measure of sacrifice the curse requires. These things rarely happen exactly as we expect them to, even for the one who cast the spell in the first place." Before Mira could press further, a sudden commotion erupted from outside the tower, the unmistakable sound of many horses arriving in haste, followed by shouted commands that carried unmistakable authority and menace. "They've found us," Mira breathed, her heart sinking, as she recognized, through the tower's narrow windows, the approaching formation of Lord Ashvale's soldiers, considerably larger now than the party that had confronted them weeks earlier, in the peaceful clearing near Aldenmere. Voss's weathered face grew grim as he too recognized the danger now converging on his isolated tower, and for the first time since their arrival, something that looked almost like genuine alarm crossed his features. "It seems," he said, rising slowly from his desk with obvious effort, "that whatever moment the curse has been waiting for may be arriving considerably sooner than any of us anticipated." "How many are there?" Mira asked urgently, moving to the narrow window to assess the danger for herself, her stomach twisting with dread at the sight of at least 30 mounted soldiers spreading out to surround the tower with practiced efficiency. "Too many for a direct confrontation," Voss admitted, already moving toward a shelf crowded with bottled ingredients, his earlier weariness replaced by a sharp, focused urgency that spoke of decades spent surviving through cleverness rather than force. "But this tower has protections built into its very stones, defenses I established long before either of you were likely born. They won't find breaching these walls nearly as simple as they might expect." "That buys us time," Mira said, "but not forever. Eventually they'll find a way through, or simply wait us out until we're forced to emerge." Thalor paced anxiously near the tower's heavy door, his ears pinned back, and his golden eyes darting between Mira and the narrow windows where the sounds of the gathering soldiers grew steadily louder and more organized. He scratched urgently at the stone floor, drawing a rough shape that Mira eventually recognized as representing herself, standing apart from the tower entirely, safely distant from whatever confrontation seemed increasingly inevitable. "No," she said firmly, understanding his silent suggestion immediately. "I'm not leaving you here to face this alone, whatever happens next. We agreed weeks ago that we would handle this together, and I meant it then, just as much as I mean it now." The wolf's expression carried a desperate, conflicted anguish, torn between his fierce desire to protect her and his growing understanding that her continued presence beside him might prove essential to whatever the curse still demanded of him. "There may be another option," Voss said suddenly, turning from his shelf with a small, worn leather pouch clutched in his weathered hands. "A temporary measure, nothing permanent, but it might buy you the time needed to escape through the tower's rear passage, while I create a distraction sufficient to draw their attention elsewhere." "You'd help us?" Mira asked, genuine surprise coloring her voice. "After everything, after cursing him in the first place, you'd risk yourself to help us escape now?" Voss's expression grew complicated, layered with old regret, and something that might have been the first genuine attempt at redemption he had allowed himself in longer than he cared to admit. "I never intended for innocent people to suffer alongside my quarrel with him," he said quietly, glancing toward Thalor with an expression that held both old anger and something gentler beneath it. "Whatever mistakes he made as king, whatever slights I felt entitled to punish so severely, none of that justifies what Ashvale now intends. If I can prevent that much harm, at least, perhaps it counts for something against the weight of everything else I've done wrong." Outside, the soldier's commander began shouting demands for surrender, his voice carrying clearly through the tower's thick walls, promising swift consequences for continued resistance and false mercy for immediate compliance, that none of them, having witnessed Ashvale's true intentions firsthand, believed for even a moment. "We don't have much time," Mira said, watching Voss work quickly to prepare whatever assistance he intended to offer, while Thalor continued his anxious pacing near the door, clearly torn between gratitude for this unexpected aid and lingering distrust toward the man who had caused him so much suffering. Grumble, who had remained unusually quiet throughout this entire tense exchange, suddenly darted toward the tower's rear wall, disappearing behind a heavy tapestry that Mira had not previously noticed, and returned moments later with an expression of obvious satisfaction, having apparently discovered the very passage Voss had mentioned. "Clever creature," Voss observed, a hint of dry amusement breaking through his tension for just a moment. "Perhaps he's been more useful to this entire situation than any of us realized from the beginning." As the shouted demands outside grew more urgent, and the first sounds of soldiers attempting to force the tower's outer defenses began echoing through the stone walls, Voss pressed the small leather pouch into Mira's hands, his expression grave and determined. "When the moment comes," he said, his eyes shifting meaningfully toward Thalor, "you'll know what needs to happen. Trust yourselves, both of you, more than you trust anything I've told you today. Curses are strange, changeable things, and I suspect this one has been waiting for something more particular than either of us yet fully understands." With that cryptic warning still hanging in the tense air of the tower's lower chamber, Voss moved toward the heavy front door, drawing himself up with whatever remained of his old sorcerer's bearing, preparing to face Lord Ashvale's forces directly, while Mira, Thalor, and Grumble slipped quietly toward the hidden rear passage, uncertain what dangers or revelations still awaited them beyond the tower's crumbling walls. The rear passage led them through a narrow, winding tunnel carved directly into the mountainside, damp stone walls pressing close on either side as they hurried forward in near total darkness, guided only by the faint light of a small candle Mira had managed to grab before leaving the chamber behind. Grumble led the way with the confident ease of a creature perfectly comfortable navigating tight, shadowy spaces, while Thalor brought up the rear, his larger frame barely fitting through some of the tunnel's narrower stretches. Behind them, muffled through layers of stone, they could hear the growing chaos of Voss's confrontation with Lord Ashvale's forces, shouted commands, and what sounded like the crackle of magical energy, though Mira could not begin to guess what specific tricks the old sorcerer might be employing to hold off dozens of trained soldiers. "We need to hurry," she whispered, though the words felt almost unnecessary, given the urgency already driving their pace through the cramped tunnel. They emerged, finally, into a small ravine on the tower's far side, hidden from the main confrontation by a natural formation of jagged rock that provided reasonable cover from anyone who might think to search this particular direction. Mira allowed herself a brief moment of relief at having escaped the tower itself, though she knew their danger remained far from over. That relief shattered almost immediately when a contingent of soldiers, apparently anticipating exactly this kind of escape attempt, emerged from behind the rocks ahead of them, weapons already drawn and expressions grimly determined. "Going somewhere?" the broad-shouldered commander from their first confrontation asked, his voice carrying a satisfaction that suggested he had anticipated this exact possibility and positioned his forces accordingly. "Lord Ashvale suspected you might attempt exactly this kind of clever escape. He's grown quite tired of this prolonged pursuit, I'm afraid." Thalor stepped protectively in front of Mira immediately, his fur bristling and a fierce growl building deep in his chest, but even his considerable strength and ferocity could not overcome the sheer numbers now surrounding them on multiple sides, cutting off any possible retreat back toward the tunnel they had just escaped through. "There's nowhere left to run," the commander continued, gesturing for his soldiers to advance slowly, weapons still raised, but movements careful and controlled, clearly under strict orders, not to risk serious injury to their intended captive. "Surrender now, and perhaps Lord Ashvale shows some mercy toward the woman who has been aiding you. Continue resisting, and I'm afraid I cannot promise the same restraint." Mira felt her heart pounding with terror, not for herself, but for Thalor, understanding, with sudden, painful clarity, exactly what kind of impossible choice this confrontation was about to force upon him. Surrender meant becoming exactly the puppet king Ashvale intended to create, while continued resistance risked her own safety directly, a threat she suspected Thalor would find impossible to accept regardless of the personal cost to himself. The soldiers continued advancing, closing the circle steadily tighter, and Thalor's desperate golden eyes found Mira's for one final, searching moment, communicating an agony of indecision that needed no elaborate gesture to understand. "Don't," she said quietly, understanding exactly what he was silently asking permission for. "Don't surrender because of me. Whatever happens, I won't let that be the reason you give up everything we've fought so hard to protect." But even as she spoke these brave words, she saw the soldiers' formation tighten further, spears leveling not at Thalor directly, given their orders to capture him unharmed, but toward her instead, the far simpler target whose safety could be threatened, without risking Lord Ashvale's precious prize. "Enough of this," the commander said, his patience clearly exhausted. "Lower your weapons toward the wolf's throat," he ordered two of his soldiers, gesturing toward Mira with grim finality, "and place your blade against the woman's neck instead. Perhaps that will finally convince our reluctant guest to cooperate." The soldier assigned this grim task moved forward, and Mira felt the cold press of steel against her throat, her breath catching with genuine terror despite her earlier brave declarations. She watched Thalor's entire body go rigid with horror at this direct threat, every instinct screaming at him to act, to protect her regardless of any personal cost, while the curse's careful restrictions against acts of desperate violence hovered uncertainly between his fury and his fear. "Let her go," Thalor's growl seemed to convey, though of course no actual words emerged, only the raw desperation of a creature watching someone he had come to love threatened with immediate harm. "Surrender," the commander demanded again, "and this ends peacefully. Continue resisting, and I promise you, this will not end well for her." For one terrible, extended moment, Thalor stood frozen, torn between every instinct demanding he fight regardless of consequence, and the terrible understanding that any sudden movement might result in the blade at Mira's throat finding its mark before he could possibly intervene in time. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive head toward the ground, in a gesture of complete and total surrender, stepping forward, with obvious anguish, to place himself directly within reach of the soldier's waiting chains and restraints, choosing Mira's immediate safety over every ounce of his own freedom and pride. "No!" Mira cried out, understanding immediately what he had chosen, and desperate to stop him even as the blade remained pressed against her throat. "Thalor, don't. This is exactly what they want." But he continued forward regardless, ignoring her desperate protests entirely, focused solely on ensuring the immediate threat against her was removed, regardless of what cost his own surrender might ultimately demand of him. As the first heavy chain settled around his massive neck, something extraordinary began happening throughout the small ravine. The golden light that had always seemed to burn behind his eyes intensified suddenly, spreading outward until his entire massive form began glowing with an unmistakable magical brilliance that sent the surrounding soldiers stumbling backward in alarm and confusion. "What's happening?" the commander shouted, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by genuine fear as the light continued building, growing brighter and more intense with each passing second. Mira watched, breathless with shock and hope in equal measure, as Thalor's wolf form began shifting and reshaping itself before everyone's astonished eyes, bones and fur giving way gradually to the unmistakable form of a man, tall and weary, but unmistakably human, kneeling in the center of the golden light, with chains still wrapped uselessly around a form that had already transformed entirely beyond their intended purpose. The soldier holding the blade against Mira's throat stumbled backward in shock, his grip loosening entirely, and she scrambled free immediately, rushing forward toward the kneeling figure who had once been an enormous, cursed wolf, and was now, impossibly, entirely and completely human once more. "Thalor," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him as the golden light finally faded, leaving him blinking in apparent disorientation at his own restored hands and human form after 6 long months, trapped within a wolf's body. "It worked," he said, his voice rough and unused but unmistakably his own for the first time since she had known him, tears streaming freely down his face as he stared at his own restored hands with an expression of profound, overwhelming disbelief. "The curse. It's actually broken." The soldiers surrounding them stood frozen in stunned confusion, their carefully planned confrontation collapsing entirely in the face of this impossible, miraculous transformation unfolding directly before their disbelieving eyes. "You chose me," Mira said, understanding finally settling over her as she processed exactly what had triggered this long-awaited breaking of the curse. "Over your own freedom, over everything you'd been trying so desperately to protect for 6 months. You chose my safety without any hesitation at all." "Of course I did," Thalor said, his newly restored voice carrying an emotion so raw and genuine that it needed no further explanation. "There was never really a choice at all, Mira. Not when it came to protecting you." The commander, recovering slightly from his initial shock, stepped forward with obvious uncertainty about how to proceed given this dramatically altered situation. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, clearly recalculating his entire approach, now that his intended captive had transformed unexpectedly into the very king Lord Ashvale had hoped to control, through leverage and manipulation, rather than legitimate authority. "This changes everything considerably." "Yes," Thalor agreed, rising slowly to his feet despite obvious exhaustion, drawing himself up with a restored bearing that immediately commanded attention despite his weakened, disheveled state after 6 months of hardship. I imagine it does. Return to Lord Ashvale and inform him that his king has returned, restored, and entirely aware of exactly what schemes he set in motion during my prolonged absence. Tell him I look forward to discussing the matter directly, and very soon. The soldiers, uncertain how to respond to this sudden reversal of their entire mission, glanced toward each other with obvious confusion before their commander, recognizing the shifted balance of power immediately and completely, ordered a hasty and disorganized retreat back toward wherever Lord Ashvale awaited news of his failed capture attempt. As the soldiers departed, and silence finally settled over the small ravine, Thalor turned back to Mira, his restored human eyes carrying the same warmth and gratitude she had grown so accustomed to seeing in his golden wolf's gaze over the past 2 months of their unlikely companionship. I don't know how to properly thank you, he said quietly, reaching out to take her hands in his own restored fingers for the very first time. For everything. For seeing past the curse. For believing in me, when you had every reason to be afraid instead. For standing beside me through all of this danger and difficulty. You don't need to thank me, Mira said, feeling tears of her own beginning to fall, as the full weight of everything they had endured together finally caught up with her. I told you weeks ago. We were figuring this out together. I meant every word of that promise. Grumble, who had watched this entire dramatic transformation from a safe distance atop a nearby boulder, chose this precise moment to saunter over and wind himself around Thalor's now considerably smaller human legs, purring loudly with obvious satisfaction at having played, in his own arrogant estimation, an essential role in bringing about this long-awaited resolution. Thalor laughed, a genuine warm sound that Mira realized she had never actually heard from him before, not in all their months of careful gestures and crude drawings scratched into dirt and frost. Even now, he said, reaching down to scratch gently behind the cat's ears, you still can't resist claiming credit for everything, can you? As the last light of afternoon began painting the ravine in soft golden hues, the three of them, king, village woman, and thoroughly satisfied cat, finally allowed themselves a genuine moment of relief and celebration, having survived against every difficult odds to reach this long-awaited, hard-won breaking of a curse that had once seemed impossible to overcome. But even amid this joyful reunion, both Mira and Thalor understood clearly that their journey remained far from truly finished. Lord Ashvale still commanded considerable resources and ambition back in the capital, and reclaiming the throne properly, restoring genuine order to a kingdom thrown into uncertainty by his prolonged absence, would require careful diplomacy and difficult decisions still waiting to be made in the days and weeks ahead. They returned to Wren's mountain cottage that same evening, moving slowly given Thalor's unfamiliar exhaustion in a body he had not properly inhabited in 6 long months, every muscle aching in ways his wolf form had never quite prepared him for. Wren greeted their arrival with visible astonishment, quickly followed by genuine warmth as she ushered them inside and began preparing a proper meal, for the first time Thalor had eaten as a man since the curse first took hold of him. I confess I hoped for this outcome, Wren admitted, watching him eat with obvious satisfaction, despite his considerably more refined table manners returning slowly and somewhat awkwardly after months spent hunting and eating as a wolf, though I never quite expected it to happen so dramatically, or so quickly, once you finally reached that confrontation. None of us expected it, Mira said, still processing the whirlwind of emotions from the day's events. Voss himself seemed uncertain exactly what moment the curse was waiting for. Curses like his are rarely simple, Wren said thoughtfully, settling into her usual chair beside the fire. They respond to genuine transformation, not clever manipulation or calculated performance. I suspect the curse recognized something true in that moment, something that finally satisfied whatever lesson Voss originally intended to teach, however cruel and misguided his methods for teaching it may have been. Thalor's expression grew troubled at the mention of Voss, his gratitude for finally breaking free of the curse, mixing uncomfortably with genuine concern for the old sorcerer's fate, given what confrontation with Lord Ashvale's forces likely meant for someone attempting to hold them off single-handedly. We should try to learn what happened to him, he said quietly. Whatever grievance existed between us, whatever suffering his curse caused me these past months, He still risked himself considerably to help us escape today. That deserves acknowledgement, at the very least. A generous sentiment, Wren observed, particularly coming from someone who spent 6 months as a hunted, hungry wolf because of that same man's bitter grudge. Perhaps that curse taught you more than even Voss originally intended. Thalor considered this quietly for a long moment, turning his newly restored hands over thoughtfully, as though still marveling at their existence after so many months without them. Perhaps it did, he admitted finally. I understand things now that I never properly understood before, sitting comfortably on my throne, surrounded by people too careful, or too fearful, to ever challenge my assumptions directly. Hunger teaches lessons that comfort never can. So does genuine fear, and genuine gratitude for small kindnesses freely given. They remained at Wren's cottage for 3 additional days, allowing Thalor time to properly recover his strength, before undertaking the difficult journey back toward the capital, and whatever confrontation with Lord Ashvale still awaited them there. During this time, careful plans began taking shape, built around information Wren possessed regarding loyal nobles, who had likely remained skeptical of Ashvale's opportunistic claims to authority during the king's prolonged absence. There's Lord Camden, in the eastern provinces, Wren suggested during one such planning discussion, and Lady Rosalind, who commands considerable respect among the merchant guilds, despite holding no formal noble title herself. Both have reputations for genuine integrity that Ashvale's ambitious maneuvering likely never managed to fully corrupt or intimidate. If we can reach them, Thalor said, and demonstrate proof of my genuine identity and restoration, their support could prove essential in reclaiming legitimate authority, without resorting to open conflict that would only harm innocent people caught in the middle of this power struggle. Mira listened to these careful political discussions, with growing understanding of just how complicated Thalor's proper return to power would prove, recognizing that breaking the curse, while enormously significant, represented only the first step in a much longer, more delicate process of restoring genuine stability to a kingdom thrown into uncertainty and opportunistic scheming. "What happens to us?" she asked one evening, as they sat together outside Wren's cottage, watching stars emerge slowly across the darkening mountain sky. "Once you're properly restored to your throne, once all of this political maneuvering finally settles into whatever new arrangement emerges from it." Thalor turned to look at her directly, his restored human expression carrying an intensity that made her breath catch slightly, so different from yet somehow exactly the same as the golden-eyed gaze she had grown to love over these past difficult months. "I meant what I told you in that ravine," he said quietly. "There was never really a choice when it came to protecting you. That remains just as true now as it did then, curse or no curse, throne or no throne. Whatever happens with Ashvale, whatever political complications await us in the capital, I don't intend to simply return to my old life as though these past months, as though everything we've built together, never happened at all." Mira felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved deeply by the sincerity carried in every word of his quiet declaration. "I don't want to go back to how things were either," she admitted softly. "Not entirely, anyway. Whatever happens next, I want to face it together, the same way we've faced everything else since Grumble stole that first rabbit." As if summoned by this mention, Grumble himself padded over from wherever he had been exploring the mountain hollow, settling comfortably between them, with his usual proprietary confidence, purring contentedly, as though thoroughly satisfied with how successfully his initial theft had ultimately transformed into this unlikely, hard-won happy resolution for everyone involved. The day departed Wren's cottage on the 4th morning, properly rested and equipped with whatever assistance the old woman could provide, beginning the long journey back toward the capital and the difficult political confrontation that still awaited them there, carrying with them not just the hope of reclaiming a rightful throne, but a bond, forged through months of genuine hardship and connection, that neither crown nor kingdom could ever fully diminish or replace. The road to the capital wound through familiar territory that Thalor had once traveled countless times, as a young prince, and later as a newly crowned king, though everything about the journey now felt different, colored by 6 months of hardship that had reshaped how he saw every field, every village, every ordinary person, going about their daily lives along the way. They stopped first at Lord Camden's estate in the eastern provinces, a modest but well-maintained property that reflected its owner's reputation for practical honesty over ostentatious display. Camden himself, a graying man with steady eyes and a firm handshake, received them with cautious hope rather than immediate certainty, understandably skeptical of any claim to royal identity, given the confusion and rumors that had swirled through the kingdom during Thalor's prolonged absence. "You'll forgive my caution," Camden said, studying Thalor carefully across his study's worn wooden desk. "Ashvale has already sent word to several noble houses claiming legitimate authority through some emergency council arrangement, and more than a few desperate impostors have surfaced these past months, hoping to exploit the confusion for their own gain." "A reasonable concern," Thalor acknowledged, and proceeded to share details of his reign that only the genuine king could possibly have known, specific disputes he had personally settled, private conversations shared with trusted advisors, small details of court life that no impostor could have reasonably fabricated with such precise accuracy. Slowly, methodically, Camden's skepticism gave way to cautious belief, and by the time their conversation concluded, he had pledged his support for Thalor's rightful return to the throne, along with a promise to help spread word discreetly, among other nobles he trusted, to remain loyal, despite Ashvale's opportunistic maneuvering. Similar conversations followed with Lady Rosalind, and several other influential figures Wren had identified as likely allies, each meeting building steadily toward a coalition of support substantial enough to challenge Ashvale's claims, without necessarily requiring the kind of open conflict that would only harm the very people Thalor now understood he had once too easily overlooked during his earlier, more comfortable reign. Word of the true king's return spread gradually through the kingdom over the following weeks, first as cautious rumor and then, as more prominent figures openly declared their support, as increasingly confirmed fact that reached even the smallest, most remote villages, including, eventually, Aldenmuir itself. Mira received a letter during this period from Oswin, the farmer whose sighting of the mysterious wolf had first sparked village speculation so many months earlier, expressing amazement at learning the true identity of the creature that had wandered their fields, and considerable pride that their humble village had somehow played such an unexpected role in the kingdom's restoration. "You've become something of a legend back home," Thalor observed with obvious amusement, reading over her shoulder as she reviewed the letter's contents. "The woman who tamed the cursed Wolf King, according to Oswin's rather generous retelling." "I didn't tame anyone," Mira laughed, though she felt a warm flush of pleasure at the sentiment regardless. "We figured this out together, remember? That's what I keep telling everyone who asks." The confrontation with Lord Ashvale, when it finally arrived, proved far less violent than either of them had feared throughout their long journey back toward the capital. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Thalor's genuine restoration and the substantial coalition of noble support that had gathered around his rightful claim, Ashvale's carefully constructed authority collapsed almost entirely within days of Thalor's arrival at the capital, his soldiers deserting his cause rather than risk standing against a legitimately restored king, backed by such considerable support. Ashvale himself was stripped of his titles and lands, though Thalor, drawing on lessons learned through his own months of genuine hardship, showed a measure of mercy that surprised many of his advisors, exiling rather than executing the ambitious lord, along with a stern warning about the consequences should he ever again attempt such dangerous scheming against the crown. Godwin, whose relentless pursuit had nearly cost them everything on multiple occasions, faced similar consequences, though Thalor found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, feeling less anger toward the man than he might have expected, recognizing in his desperate ambition and willingness to serve whoever paid best a reflection of the same kind of overlooked resentment that had originally driven Voss toward his cruel curse in the first place. As for Voss himself, word eventually reached the restored court that the old sorcerer had survived his confrontation with Ashvale's forces at the tower, though he had disappeared entirely afterward, vanishing back into whatever isolated existence he had carved out for himself over the years since his bitter departure from court. Thalor made no immediate effort to pursue him, understanding that whatever debt existed between them, complicated by both genuine harm and unexpected final assistance, deserved more careful consideration than any hasty judgment could properly provide. Mira remained at the capital throughout these turbulent weeks of political restoration, watching with quiet pride as Thalor navigated the complicated business of reclaiming his throne with a wisdom and genuine humility that had clearly been forged through his months of hardship, listening more carefully to advisors and common petitioners alike, remembering vividly what it felt like to go hungry and unheard in ways his earlier, more comfortable reign had never properly taught him. "You've changed," she observed one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens that Thalor had once taken entirely for granted and now seemed to appreciate with fresh, genuine wonder. "Not just returned to who you were before, but genuinely changed by everything that happened." "I hope so," he said quietly, taking her hand as they walked. "Voss's curse cost me a great deal, more than I ever could have imagined enduring when it first took hold of me. But I understand now, looking back, that perhaps I needed exactly that kind of difficult lesson, however cruel the method used to teach it. I don't think I could have become the king this kingdom truly deserves without first learning what it means to struggle, to depend on someone else's kindness, to genuinely value connection over pride and comfort." Grumble, who had accompanied them to the capital with characteristic proprietary confidence, had settled into palace life with remarkable ease, claiming an entire cushioned window seat in the royal chambers as his personal territory, and terrorizing the palace kitchen staff with the same fearless audacity he had once shown toward an enormous, cursed wolf in a quiet forest clearing. "He's completely insufferable now," Mira laughed, watching the cat stroll past a group of visibly intimidated palace guards with characteristic swagger. "You'd think he personally arranged your entire restoration to the throne." "In a way," Thalor said, smiling warmly as he watched the cat's confident procession, "perhaps he did. If he hadn't stolen that rabbit all those months ago, I'm not certain our paths would have crossed the way they did, or that any of this would have unfolded quite as it needed to." Several months later, as spring finally settled fully over the kingdom and the last uncertainties from Ashvale's brief, ambitious rebellion faded into history, Thalor formally recognized Mira as an honored friend of the crown, a title that carried with it both genuine respect and the freedom to remain close to him without the rigid formalities that typically governed royal relationships. But titles, both of them understood by then, mattered far less than what they had actually built together during those difficult months of hardship, deception, and danger. A genuine partnership founded on honesty, mutual respect, and the shared understanding that true strength often revealed itself, not through power or privilege, but through the quiet courage to help someone else, even when the cost seemed impossibly high. As for Grumble, he received, much to the amused disbelief of the entire royal court, a formal decree granting him permanent residence within the palace and unlimited access to the royal kitchens, an honor no cat in the kingdom's long history had ever previously received, though few among the staff who had witnessed his role in the king's remarkable restoration dared to question whether such generous treatment was truly deserved. The kingdom of Varenhollow settled into a new era of prosperity and genuine understanding between its ruler and his people, built on lessons learned through unexpected hardship and unlikely friendship, while in a quiet forest clearing near a small village called Aldenmere, an old stone wall stood empty now, of the enormous wolf who had once haunted its edges, though the story of everything that began there, with one insufferable, fearless cat and a single stolen rabbit, would be told and retold for generations to come.